The highway stretched like a gray scar across the frozen earth, cutting through Montana's empty heart towards something Daniel Cross could not name. Snow fell in slow spirals through the December twilight, each flake catching the last threads of daylight before vanishing against the windshield of his 2007 Ford F-150. The truck's heater rattled with a sound like old bones shaking, but Daniel kept his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the white line disappearing into white horizon. 52 years old, hands scarred from 24 years defusing bombs that wanted nothing more than to turn men into memory. A wedding ring in his glove box that he could not bring himself to wear or throw away. And in the passenger seat, a Belgian Malinois named Ranger, whose amber eyes reflected nothing but the kind of stillness that comes after watching too many things explode. The dog had belonged to his son. Past tense. Everything about Ryan was past tense now. Daniel's jaw tightened as he forced the thought down into the place where he kept all the things that could still hurt him, which was to say, everything. The truck's odometer read 183,000 miles, most of them acquired in the last 18 months, driving from base to base, town to town, running from a truth that rode in the seat beside him in the form of a dog who refused to eat unless Daniel ate first, who whined 3 short barks in his sleep, who carried the same ghost Daniel carried, but without the option of whiskey or distance. Corporal Ryan Cross, 24 years old, killed by an IED outside Kandahar on March 15, 2023. The same kind of device Daniel had spent 2 decades dismantling. The same wires and switches and pressure plates he could map in his sleep. But he had not been there. He had retired 2 years early, told himself he had done enough, earned his rest, let the younger men take the risk. And his son, who wanted nothing more than to be like his father, had volunteered for EOD school and died doing the job Daniel had walked away from. Sarah, his ex-wife, had said it at the funeral, her voice flat and final as a headstone. You should have been there. Maybe he would have learned better. Maybe he would have seen it. She was probably right. The snow thickened. The road narrowed. Somewhere past the Montana border, Minnesota opened like a question mark. All frozen lakes and skeleton trees, and the kind of silence that made a man hear his own pulse too loud. Daniel had no destination, just a compass pointing away from everything he knew. Away from the house in Colorado, where Ryan's bedroom still smelled like gun oil and cheap cologne. Away from the VA hospital where they handed him pills with names he could not pronounce. Away from the mirror that showed him a man who had saved hundreds of lives but could not save the one that mattered most. Ranger shifted in his seat, nose twitching toward the window. The dog's ears swiveled forward, and then came the sound. 3 short barks, sharp, insistent, the way he had been trained to signal danger. Daniel's foot hit this brake before his mind caught up. The truck fishtailed on black ice, tires screaming, the world tilting sideways in that stretched second where training and instinct wrestled for control. He spun the wheel into the skid, felt the truck straighten, brought it to a shuddering stop 10 feet from where the road curved into nothing but white. Ranger barked again, 3 times. The pattern was specific, drilled into the dog by months of training Daniel had not overseen but understood. Explosive device detected. Danger close. But there were no bombs here. Just snow and wind and the empty geography of a place where people came to disappear. Daniel killed the engine. The sudden silence rang like tinnitus. He could see nothing through the windshield except the endless static of falling snow. But Ranger was staring hard to the left, body rigid, every muscle locked on a point Daniel could not see. He opened the door. Cold hit him like a fist, 20 degrees below zero with a wind chill that turned breath to frost before it left his lungs. He pulled his canvas jacket tighter, tugged his wool cap down over his ears, and stepped into snow that came up past his ankles. Ranger leaped out behind him, landing in a crouch, nose to the ground. The dog moved forward slowly, each step deliberate, the way he had been trained to approach a potential threat. Daniel followed, boots crunching through the frozen crust, hand instinctively reaching for a sidearm he no longer carried. 20 yards from the road, the ground sloped down toward what might have been a ditch or a creek bed, hard to tell under the snow. Ranger stopped at the edge and barked 3 more times, then looked back at Daniel with an expression that managed to be both urgent and patient, the way military dogs learn to communicate when words were not an option. Daniel knelt beside him, squinting through the snow. At first he saw nothing but white on white, the kind of visual noise that could hide anything or nothing. Then his eyes adjusted, found the shape that did not belong, a dark mass half buried in the drift, too irregular to be a log, too still to be alive. He slid down the slope, snow filling his boots, and reached the shape in 4 strides. His hands moved automatically, brushing snow away from what resolved into a shoulder, an arm, a face so pale it almost disappeared against the ice. An old man, ancient, maybe 80, with skin like parchment and a tangle of white hair plastered to his skull. He wore a heavy wool coat that might have been green once, but was now the color of old moss. And beneath that, layers of flannel and thermal underwear that had done exactly nothing to stop the cold from taking him. His eyes were closed, his lips were blue. But when Daniel pressed 2 fingers to the man's throat, he found a pulse. Faint, slow, the sluggish rhythm of a body shutting down to preserve its core. Daniel did not think. Thinking was what you did when you had time. He scooped the old man up, shocked by how little he weighed, all bone and air and the memory of mass. The man's head lolled against Daniel's chest, and Daniel could feel the faint whisper of breath against his neck, could smell wood smoke and something sweeter, like honey or resin. Ranger led the way back to the truck, staying close but alert, head swiveling to track threats that existed only in the database of his training. Daniel climbed the slope one-handed, the old man cradled like a child, and by the time he reached the road, his shoulders were burning, and his breath came in white clouds that hung in the air like questions. He laid the man across the back seat of the truck, buckled him in, cranked the heater to maximum. Ranger jumped in beside him, curling against the old man's side, sharing body heat in the efficient, unsentimental way dogs understood survival. Daniel stripped off his own jacket and draped it over them both, then climbed back into the driver's seat and stared at the road ahead. The nearest town, according to his GPS, was Northwind, Minnesota, population 843, 11 miles east. He put the truck in gear and drove. The snow did not let up. The road did not improve. But something in Daniel's chest that had been clenched tight for 18 months loosened just slightly, just enough to let him breathe a little deeper. He had spent 2 years failing to save anyone, most of all himself. Maybe this old man freezing in a ditch was not absolution, but it was something, a direction that was not a way. Ranger gave a soft whine from the back seat, the first sound the dog had made, besides those 3 barks, since Ryan's funeral. Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Ranger's head resting on the old man's chest, eyes half closed, the picture of a creature who had found something worth protecting again. Yeah, Daniel thought. Me too, buddy. The lights of Northwind appeared through the snow like a constellation falling to earth. Small town. The kind where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed immediately. A single main street lined with brick buildings that remembered a more prosperous century. A church with a white steeple. A diner with a neon sign that said, "Open" in red letters half obscured by frost. And at the far end of town, set back from the road behind a chain-link fence, a long, low building made of corrugated metal and old brick and with smoke rising from a chimney that looked ready to collapse. Daniel pulled up to the building because the old man, semi-conscious now, had lifted one trembling hand and pointed toward it, his voice a rasp like wind through dead leaves. Home. That way. Home. The sign above the gate read, Whitmore Foundry Est, 1880. Beyond it, the building looked like it was held together by rust and stubbornness. The kind of place that should have been condemned decades ago, but somehow kept breathing. Dim light glowed in one window. The rest were dark or broken. Daniel carried the old man to the front door. It was unlocked. He pushed it open with his boot and stepped into a space that smelled like coal smoke and hot metal, and time itself, if time had a smell. The interior was vast and shadowed, lit only by the faint orange glow of a forge at the far end. Tools hung on the walls, hammers and tongs and devices Daniel could not name, and everywhere on shelves and hooks and suspended from the ceiling by lengths of wire were bells. Hundreds of them, thousands maybe, every size from thimble small to the dimensions of a bass drum. Some were tarnished black, some gleamed like new copper, some were cracked or dented or marked with symbols Daniel did not recognize. They hung in perfect silence, waiting for wind that never came inside. The old man stirred in Daniel's arms. His eyes opened, pale blue and rheumy, but sharp underneath the fog of hypothermia. He looked around the room as if confirming something, then looked up at Daniel and spoke in a voice that sounded like it came from the bottom of a well. You found me. Daniel carried him to a chair near the forge, a wooden thing with arms worn smooth by decades of use. He set the old man down gently, then stepped back, suddenly aware that he was standing in someone's home and life and history without invitation. Ranger padded forward, sniffed the old man's hand, then sat beside the chair as if he had been doing it his whole life. The old man reached out with one shaking hand and ran his fingers through the dog's fur. Military dog. Malinois. He looked up at Daniel. You are military too. I can tell by the way you carry yourself, the way you brought me in, like you have done it before. Daniel nodded. EOD, Explosive Ordnance Disposal, retired. How long? 2 years. The old man studied him for a long moment, eyes moving over Daniel's face the way a craftsman might examine a tool to determine its quality. Then he nodded as if confirming something he had suspected. Good. You are still young enough to be useful, but old enough to be careful. My name is Thomas Whitmore. This foundry belonged to my father and his father before him. I am the last one. There is no one else. Daniel introduced himself, then asked the question that had been forming since he saw the building. What do you make here? Bells. Thomas said it like the answer was obvious. Like what else would a man make in a place lined with bells? I make bells. Or I used to. Now I mostly keep them company while they wait to be melted down or forgotten. He coughed, a wet rattling sound that made Daniel think of pneumonia and hospitals. But Thomas waved him off when he moved to help. I am not dying tonight. Not yet. I have things I need to do first. He pointed toward the forge where coals still glowed red. There is tea on the stove. Pour us both a cup. Then sit. I want to know why a man drives through a blizzard with a dog who barks at ghosts. Daniel found the stove, found 2 tin cups that looked older than he was, poured tea that smelled like pine needles and smoke. He handed one to Thomas, kept the other, and sat on an overturned crate near the forge. The heat felt good after the cold, but it also made him aware of how tired he was, how many miles he had driven without stopping, how little he had slept in the 18 months since Ryan died. Ranger curled at his feet, head on paws, eyes still open and watchful. Thomas sipped his tea and waited. He seemed like a man who knew how to wait, who understood that some stories needed silence before they could be told. Daniel stared into his cup and spoke. I had a son. His name was Ryan. He wanted to be like me. EOD. Diffusing bombs, saving lives. He was good at it, better than I was at his age. But he was 24 and fearless, and that is a combination that gets you killed. He died doing the job I taught him to want, and I was not there to stop it. The words came out flat, factual, the way he had learned to deliver after action reports. But underneath the facts was the weight of everything he could not say, the alternate timeline where he had stayed in, where he had been there, where maybe Ryan would have learned to be a little less fearless and a little more alive. Thomas nodded slowly. Then you carry him, the same way I carried my brother for 52 years. Daniel looked up. The old man's eyes were distant now, focused on something beyond the walls of the foundry. His name was William. Thomas spoke quietly, the way people talk about the dead when they are alone with them. He was 7 years younger than me. Brilliant. The best bell maker our family ever produced. He could hear metal the way a musician hears a symphony. He could tell you if a bell would ring true just by looking at the copper, by feeling the weight of the bronze in his hand. He made bells that sang like angels, and the military wanted him to make weapons instead. The forge popped, sending up a small shower of sparks. Neither man moved. This was 1972. Vietnam. The war that ate everyone it touched. William was classified as essential civilian personnel, which meant he did not have to go fight, but they wanted him to make something for them, a weapon. They called it a sonic disruptor. The idea was that certain frequencies could disorient enemy combatants, make them sick, make them run. William said it was possible. He said a bell could do that if you shaped it wrong, if you tuned it to the resonance that broke things instead of calling them together. But he refused to build it. He said bells were for remembering, not for killing. Thomas paused to drink his tea, both hands wrapped around the cup as if drawing warmth from it. They told him he was being unpatriotic, that he was letting soldiers die, that his refusal had blood on it. He did not care. He said there were some things a man does not do even if his country asked him to. He said integrity was the only thing a man owns that no one can take from him unless he gives it away. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. He knew that kind of choice. The military was full of them. Orders that made tactical sense but moral none. He had followed most of them, questioned a few, refused one, which was how he ended up retiring 2 years early with a general discharge that was honorable on paper, but felt like failure. So what happened? Daniel asked. Thomas set down his cup. William disappeared. Christmas Eve, 1972. There was a storm, the kind we get up here that buries everything. He went out to the lake, to his workshop. He had built it over the water, on pilings, so he could work with the sound of the waves. He said water helped him hear the bells better. That night, he took his notes, his tools, everything he had been working on, and he went out into the storm. They found his coat on the ice the next morning. No body, no workshop. It had broken through the ice and sunk. They called it an accident. I called it murder. You think the military killed him? Thomas shook his head. I think the guilt killed him. The weight of saying no when everyone else said yes. The weight of believing in something no one else believed in. He was not built for that kind of loneliness. So he walked into the storm and let the lake decide. That is what I tell myself. Because the other possibility, the one I cannot let myself believe, is that he succeeded, that he finished his work and hid it somewhere I could never find it, that he has been waiting 52 years for someone to understand what he was trying to do. Silence filled the foundry, broken only by the soft wheeze of Thomas's breathing and the low crackle of the forge. Daniel looked around the space at the thousands of bells hanging in the darkness, each one a voice that had been silenced. He thought about Ryan, about the choice to retire early, about the guilt that had driven him across half the country with nothing but a bow and a truck, and the vague hope that distance could outrun memory. Why are you telling me this, he asked. Because tomorrow morning, Thomas said, a lawyer named Father Michael Hayes will come to this foundry with my will. In that will, I have left a challenge. Whoever can cast 7 bells by Christmas, 7 bells that ring true and perfect, will inherit this foundry and everything in it. I have no children, no heirs. But I cannot let this place die with me. My brother gave his life to protect what we do here. I will not let it be for nothing. Daniel stood. This is not my fight. I am just passing through. Thomas looked at him with eyes that seemed to see through skin and bone to the guilt and grief underneath. Are you passing through, or are you doing what my brother did, walking into the storm because it is easier than staying? The words hit harder than Daniel expected. He turned toward the door, ready to leave, ready to get back in his truck and drive until there was nothing behind him but tire tracks and distance. But Ranger did not move. The dog sat beside Thomas's chair, looking up at Daniel with an expression that was somehow both calm and insistent, the way he used to look at Ryan when Ryan was about to do something stupid. Daniel stopped. His hand was on the door handle. Cold air seeped through the gap, carrying with it the smell of snow and metal and the smoke from a dozen chimneys scattered across Northwind. How long do I have? He asked without turning around. Thomas's voice came from behind him, steady and certain. 14 days. Christmas is 14 days away. And if I fail, then this place becomes a parking lot for whatever developer wants it most. And 7 generations of bellmakers will end with me. Thomas paused. But I do not think you will fail. I think you are the kind of man who does not know how to quit, even when he wants to. Daniel opened the door. Wind hit him, carrying snow that stung his face like thrown sand. He looked out at his truck, at the road beyond, at the easy escape that waited 10 steps away. Then he looked back at Ranger, who had not moved, who sat beside the old man, like a soldier waiting for orders he knew would come. Daniel closed the door. He turned around. He walked back to the forge and stood in front of Thomas Whitmore, this old man who should have died in a ditch but did not, who carried his brother like a stone in his chest for 52 years and refused to let that weight crush him. I will stay, Daniel said, but not for you and not for your brother. I will stay because my son's dog will not leave, and I made a promise a long time ago that I would not abandon anyone who depended on me. Even if I already broke that promise once. Thomas smiled. It was a small thing, barely a curve of his lips, but it carried something Daniel had not seen in a long time. Hope. Not the cheap kind that comes easy and breaks easier. The kind built from loss and survival, and the stubborn refusal to believe that the story ends where the pain begins. Good, Thomas said. Then we start tomorrow. But tonight you sleep. There is a cot in the back room. It is not much, but it is warm and it is dry, and sometimes that is enough. Daniel nodded. He walked toward the back of the foundry, Ranger at his heels, and found the room Thomas described, a narrow space with a cot, a blanket, a pillow that smelled like dust and old wool. He lay down without taking off his boots. Ranger jumped up beside him, curling into the space between Daniel's chest and the wall. Through the thin walls, Daniel could hear Thomas moving around the forge, the soft clink of metal on metal, the low humble of the old man's voice as he spoke to the bells. Daniel could not make out the words, but the tone was clear. Gratitude, apology, the kind of conversation a man has with the things he loves when he knows he is running out of time to say what needs to be said. Daniel closed his eyes. For the first time in 18 months, he did not see Ryan's face. He did not see the explosion, or the aftermath, or the flag folded into a triangle and handed to a mother whose eyes blamed him for being alive when her son was not. Instead, he saw bells, thousands of them, waiting in the dark, waiting for someone to give them a voice again. He slept and dreamed of fire. Morning came pale and cold, the kind of December dawn that arrives without announcement, just a slow bleed of gray light through frosted windows. Daniel woke to the sound of metal striking metal, a rhythmic clanging that pulled him from sleep like a hand on his shoulder. For a moment, he did not know where he was. The ceiling above him was corrugated tin instead of plaster, and the air smelled like coal and copper instead of coffee and regret. Then memory returned. The blizzard, the old man, the foundry full of bells, and the promise he had made before he could talk himself out of it. He sat up. Ranger was already gone, and when Daniel walked out of the back room, he found the dog sitting near the forge watching Thomas Whitmore work. The old man looked smaller in daylight, more fragile, but his hands moved with the kind of certainty that comes from a lifetime of repetition. He stood at a workbench near the forge, using a file to smooth the edge of a copper disc no bigger than a silver dollar. The motion was slow, deliberate, each stroke of the file removing a microscopic layer of metal. He did not look up when Daniel approached, but he spoke. A bell is only as good as the man who makes it. If your hands are impatient, the bell will crack. If your mind is elsewhere, the bell will ring false. This is not a job for people who want to be somewhere else. This is a job for people who understand that some things cannot be rushed and should not be. Daniel watched him work. The file hissed against the copper, releasing a smell like old pennies. Good morning to you too. Thomas glanced up, eyes sharp despite the age that had settled into every other part of his body. If you are going to learn to make bells in 14 days, we do not have time for pleasantries. We have time for work. That is all. He set down the file and gestured toward a corner of the foundry where 7 wooden molds stood in a row, each one a different size, each one marked with a number burned into the wood. 1 through 7. The smallest was the size of a teacup. The largest was big enough to fit a man's head inside. These are your molds, Thomas said. Each one is designed to cast a bell with a specific tone, a specific frequency. The first is 256 hertz. The last is 512. Together they form a scale, an octave. If you cast all 7 correctly, if they ring true, they will harmonize. They will sing. That is your task. Daniel walked over to the molds. They were old, the wood worn smooth and dark from decades of use. He ran his hand over the surface of the first one, felt the precise curve of the interior, the way it narrowed at the top and flared at the bottom to create the shape a bell needed to resonate properly. And if I cast them wrong, then they will be useless. A bell that does not ring true is not a bell. It is just metal shaped like hope, but empty of it. Thomas moved to join him, leaning heavily on a cane Daniel had not noticed before. Bell making is not forgiving. You get one chance with each casting. The metal remembers. If you make a mistake, you have to melt it down and start over. And we do not have time to start over. Daniel looked at the 7 molds, then at the forge where coals glowed red and ready. He thought about EOD work, about the way a single wrong cut could turn a diffused bomb into a detonation, about the precision required to stay alive when death was always one mistake away. This was not so different, just a different kind of pressure, a different kind of failure. All right, he said, teach me. Thomas smiled. Then we begin with listening. He led Daniel to the far wall where bells of every size hung from hooks and wires. He selected one, a medium-sized bell made of bronze that had tarnished to a deep green. He held it up, then struck it with a small wooden mallet. The sound that emerged was pure and clear, a single note that seemed to expand to fill the entire foundry. It rang for 10 seconds, 15, 20, the vibration visible in the way dust motes danced in the air around it. Then slowly, reluctantly, it faded into silence. "That is C sharp," Thomas said. 432 hertz. The frequency of the earth itself, some say. The tone that everything returns to. He handed Daniel the mallet. "Now you." Daniel took the mallet, struck the bell. The sound came again, identical to before, and he listened as Thomas had told him to. Listen not just with his ears, but with something deeper. Something that felt the vibration in his chest, in his bones, in the base of his skull. He understood in that moment why Thomas called it singing. This was not just sound. This was communication. The bell was speaking a language older than words, and if he was going to cast 7 of them, he needed to learn how to hear what they were saying. They spent the morning like that. Thomas would strike a bell, name its frequency, describe its tone: bright, dark, warm, cold, brittle, smooth. Each bell had a personality, a character shaped by the alloy used and the temperature of the casting and the skill of the maker. Daniel listened until his head ached from concentration, until he could close his eyes and identify a bell by sound alone. By noon, his ears were ringing and his throat was dry. Thomas called a break, and they ate lunch at the workbench, simple food pulled from a small refrigerator in the corner. Bread and cheese and slices of apple that had gone soft. Ranger got his share, the dog eating slowly, methodically, the way he always did, as if suspicious that the food might disappear if he rushed. "You said your brother died for this," Daniel said between bites. "Died to protect bell making. Why? What is so important about bells that a man would give his life for them?" Thomas chewed slowly, thinking. "When my grandfather started this foundry in 1880, it was because the church needed bells. Every church had a bell tower, and every bell tower needed a bell that could be heard across town, across fields, across the distance between a man and God. Bells were how you called people together, how you marked time, how you announced birth and death and everything in between." He gestured around the foundry. "This place has cast bells for 144 years. Every bell has a story. Every bell remembers something. When you destroy a foundry, you do not just destroy a building, you destroy memory itself." Daniel thought about that, thought about all the things that held memory: photographs, letters, the dog tags he still carried in his pocket, Ryan's name stamped into metal that would outlast both of them. Memory was not passive, it was physical, it had weight. And maybe bells were just another way of giving that weight a voice. The afternoon was spent learning the chemistry of bronze. Thomas explained that a bell was not pure copper or pure tin, but an alloy of both, the ratio precise and unforgiving. Too much copper and the bell would be shifty, dull, prone to cracking. Too much tin and it would be brittle, sharp, shattering under its own weight. The perfect bell was 78% copper, 22% tin, mixed at a temperature of 1085 degrees Celsius, and poured in one continuous flow, so the molecules locked together without seam or weakness. Daniel took notes in a small notebook he found on the workbench, filling pages with ratios and temperatures in the dozen variables that separated success from failure. It reminded him of EOD school, the endless memorization of wire colors and chemical compounds in blast radiuses. Both jobs demanded perfection. Both punished mistakes without mercy. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the foundry's broken windows, Thomas led Daniel to the forge. It was a massive thing, built from fire brick and iron, with a blower attached that could raise the temperature to levels that turned metal into liquid light. Thomas showed him how to load the coal, how to adjust the airflow, how to read the color of the flames to know when the heat was right. Then he pointed to a crucible, a ceramic cup designed to hold molten metal. "Tomorrow we cast your first bell. Tonight you prepare. You study the mold. You measure the copper and tin. You get everything ready so that when the moment comes, you do not have to think. You just do." Thinking during a casting is how you make mistakes. Mistakes are how you fail. Daniel nodded. He spent the next 2 hours weighing copper ingots and tin pellets on a scale so old it might have been original to the foundry. He arranged them in the order he would need them. He studied the first mold until he could see its shape with his eyes closed. And all the while, Thomas sat in his chair near the forge, watching, saying nothing, just being present in the way a teacher is present when a student needs to figure something out alone. As night fell and the foundry grew cold, except for the circle of warmth around the forge, Daniel heard a knock at the door. Thomas looked up, unsurprised, and called out, "Come in, Michael." The door opened and a man entered, older than Daniel but younger than Thomas, maybe late 60s, with silver hair and the kind of face that had smiled so much it had worn creases into permanent expression. He wore a black coat and a white collar that marked him as clergy, and he carried a leather satchel that looked as old as the foundry itself. "Father Michael Hayes," Thomas said by way of introduction. "My oldest friend and the executor of my will." Michael shook Daniel's hand. His grip was firm, warm, the handshake of someone who had spent a lifetime greeting strangers and making them feel less strange. "So you are the man Thomas has been waiting for." "I am just passing through," Daniel said automatically. Michael smiled. "That is what everyone says. Right until the moment they realize they have stopped passing and started staying." He set his satchel on the workbench and pulled out a manila folder. Inside were documents, official-looking papers with seals and signatures. Michael spread them out, pointing to the relevant sections as he spoke. "Thomas has made his wishes very clear. If you successfully cast 7 bells before Christmas Day, this foundry and the land it sits on will transfer to your name. Free and clear. No liens, no debts. It is worth approximately $400,000, though that value assumes someone wants to keep it as a foundry. If you were to sell it for development, the land alone is worth closer to $3 million. Daniel looked at Thomas. "You are giving me $3 million if I can cast 7 bells? Thomas shook his head. "I am giving you something to care about. The money is irrelevant. What matters is that this place continues, that the bells do not stop." He leaned forward, eyes intense. "My brother died believing that some things are worth more than survival, worth more than profit. I need to know he was right. I need to see that there are still men in this world who understand what he understood. That legacy is not what you leave behind when you die. It is what you build while you are alive that outlasts you." Michael added quietly, "There is one other thing. A man named Robert Brennan has expressed interest in purchasing this property. He is a developer, well-connected, and he has the backing to make this foundry disappear and replace it with something more profitable. Thomas has refused his offers. But if Thomas dies without a clear successor, the property will go to probate, and Brennan will have the legal standing to make a claim. This challenge is not just about finding someone to carry on the work. It is about preventing someone from destroying it." Daniel looked at the documents, at the clauses and conditions spelled out in language he would need a lawyer to fully understand. Then he looked at Thomas, who sat watching him with the kind of patience that only comes from knowing that some decisions cannot be rushed. "Who is Robert Brennan?" Daniel asked. Thomas's expression darkened. "Someone I used to know, a long time ago, before he became what he is now." "That is not an answer." "No," Thomas agreed, "but it is the only one I can give you tonight. If you stay, you will meet him soon enough. And then you will understand why I need someone strong enough to stand against him." Daniel wanted to press further, but something in Thomas's face told him the conversation was over. He turned to Michael instead. "And you? What do you get out of this?" Michael closed the folder. "I get to watch an old friend die knowing he did not die alone. That is enough for me." There was something in the way he said it, something that carried the weight of long history and shared grief, that made Daniel nod. He understood that kind of loyalty, had felt it for the men he served with, the ones who made it home and the ones who did not. It was the kind of bond that did not require explanation because it was built from shared experience no one else could understand. Michael left shortly after, promising to return in a week to check on progress. When he was gone, Thomas stood slowly, joints popping, and made his way toward the back room where Daniel had slept the night before. At the door, he paused and looked back. "You asked me earlier why bells matter, why my brother gave his life for them. I will tell you something he told me once, the week before he disappeared. He said that a bell is the only instrument that plays the same note every time. A piano goes out of tune. A violin's strings break. A human voice changes with age. But a bell, if it is cast correctly, will ring the same note 1,000 years from now as it does today. It is the closest thing we have to permanence, to truth that does not change. He believed that mattered, that in a world where everything is temporary, we need things that last. Thomas disappeared into the back room. Daniel stood alone in the foundry, surrounded by thousands of bells that hung silent in the darkness. He thought about permanence, about truth, about the way Ryan's dog tags felt in his pocket, solid and unchanging. A piece of his son that would outlast memory and grief and everything else time could erode. Maybe Thomas was right. Maybe some things did need to last. Ranger padded over and sat at Daniel's feet, looking up at him with amber eyes that reflected the dying light of the forge. Daniel reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears. "All right," he said quietly. "We will try, but I am not promising anything." Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. It was not agreement. It was not reassurance. It was just acknowledgement. The dog heard him. That was enough. Daniel walked to the first mold, the smallest one, and placed his hand on the smooth wood. Tomorrow he would learn if he could do this, if he could take copper and tin and fire and make them sing, if he could honor the dead by giving them a voice that would outlast both grief and time. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering Northwind in fresh white, erasing tracks and filling footprints and making the world look new, even though everything underneath stayed exactly the same. In the foundry, the forge cooled and the bells waited, and Daniel Cross stood in the darkness, trying to believe that starting over was possible for men like him, trying to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had finally stopped running. The first light of dawn came as a rumor through the frosted windows, pale and hesitant, as if uncertain whether the world deserved another day. Daniel had been awake for an hour already, standing at the forge with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands, staring at the first mold, as though he could learn its secrets through sheer force of will. The wooden form sat on the workbench like a challenge, its interior curve catching shadows that made it look deeper than it was. Infinite almost, a well that went down into some place where mistakes were permanent and forgiveness was a foreign language. Ranger lay near the dying embers of last night's fire, chin resting on his paws, eyes tracking Daniel's movements with the patient attention of a creature who had learned that watching was sometimes the only way to help. The dog had not eaten yet, would not eat until Daniel did. It was a habit that had started after Ryan died, this mirroring of grief, this refusal to take comfort while the man he depended on went without it. Thomas emerged from the back room moving like a man made of glass, each step careful and considered, as though a sudden movement might shatter something essential. He wore the same clothes as yesterday, flannel over thermal, wool over flannel, layers of fabric that could not quite hide how thin he had become. His hands shook slightly as he poured himself tea from the pot that sat perpetually warm on the stove. But when he turned to face Daniel, his eyes were clear and sharp, the eyes of a man who had outlived his body through sheer stubborn refusal to quit before the work was done. "Today you cast your first bell," Thomas said, "the bell of listening. 256 hertz, the frequency of middle C, the note everything else is measured against. If you cannot cast this one true, the other 6 will be impossible." He moved to the workbench, set down his cup, and placed both hands on the mold as if blessing it. This bell teaches patience. The metal must cool at exactly the right speed. Too fast and it will crack. Too slow and it will warp. You cannot rush it. You cannot force it. You can only wait and listen. That is why it is first, because everything else depends on learning how to hear what the metal is telling you. Daniel nodded, feeling the weight of instructions settle on his shoulders like a yoke. He had spent yesterday memorizing ratios and temperatures, filling his head with numbers that felt abstract until this moment, when the reality of turning knowledge into action made his hands sweat despite the cold. He moved to the pile of copper ingots stacked near the forge, selected the ones he had measured last night, confirmed their weight on the ancient scale. 7 pounds, 3 ounces. Exactly. The tin came next, measured in smaller increments, pellets of gray metal that looked dull and lifeless next to the copper's warm glow. 1 pound, 14 ounces. He double-checked, triple-checked. Thomas watched without comment, understanding that this obsessive precision was not hesitation but preparation. The muscle memory of a man trained to know that details were the difference between mission success and body bags. "Load the crucible," Thomas instructed, Copper first, then tin when the copper is fully molten. The crucible was a ceramic vessel the size of a coffee can, scarred from decades of use, its interior glazed with residue from 1,000 previous castings. Daniel placed it in the heart of the forge, then began loading coal around it, building a nest of fuel that would burn hot and even. Thomas handed him a long iron rod. Use this to adjust the coals. Keep them packed tight around the crucible. Air is the enemy. Air cools. We need heat that does not know how to quit. Daniel worked the bellows, pumping air into the forge's base, watching as the coals began to glow. First red, then orange, then that particular shade of yellow-white that meant the temperature was climbing past 1,000 degrees. Sweat broke out on his forehead despite the December cold that leaked through every gap in the foundry's walls. The heat was immediate and total, a physical presence that pushed against his face and hands, making his eyes water, making his lungs work harder to find air that had not been scorched of moisture. Now the copper, Thomas said. Daniel used tongs to lift the ingots, dropping them one by one into the crucible. They sat there for a moment, and unchanging, demerit in the face of heat. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, they began to soften at the edges, the hard lines blurring, the metal starting to weep as its crystalline structure surrendered to temperature. 5 minutes. 10. The copper collapsed in on itself, becoming liquid, becoming light, a pool of molten orange that swirled with its own internal currents. The tin, Thomas prompted. Daniel added it carefully, watching as the gray pellets hit the surface and vanished instantly, swallowed by the copper, integrating at a molecular level. He used the rod to stir, mixing the alloy, watching the color shift subtly as the tin changed the copper's character, made it harder, made it capable of resonance instead of just mass. 20 minutes at temperature, Thomas said, pulling out a pocket watch that looked like it had been old when the foundry was new. Then we pour. But before we do, I need you to understand something. When you pour this metal, you are not just filling a mold. You are making a promise that this bell will ring true not just today, but 100 years from today. 1,000. You are reaching forward in time and shaking hands with people who are not born yet, telling them that what you made matters, that it will still matter when their grandchildren are dust. That is not a small thing. That is the weight every bellmaker carries. The knowledge that we are making permanence in a world built from things that break. Daniel stared into the crucible, watching the metal shimmer and pulse, and thought about permanence, about his son's name carved into black granite in Arlington, about the dog tags in his pocket, about all the ways people tried to cheat mortality by leaving something behind that could not die. Maybe Thomas was right. Maybe a bell was just another way of saying I was here and it meant something. The pocket watch clicked. Time. Thomas handed him heavy leather gloves, then a pair of tongs designed to grip the crucible's rim. Daniel lifted the vessel from the forge, feeling its weight, feeling the heat radiate through the leather and into his palms. He moved to the mold, positioned himself carefully, then began to pour. The metal came out in a stream of light, liquid fire that seemed to carry its own illumination, bright enough to cast shadows on the ceiling 30 feet above. It hit the mold's interior with a sound like a sigh, filling the cavity from bottom to top in one smooth flow, no stops, no breaks, exactly as Thomas had instructed. The bronze settled, finding its level, and Daniel set the empty crucible aside, hands shaking from adrenaline and heat in the strange exhilaration of creation. Now we wait, Thomas said. 4 hours for the initial cooling, then overnight for the metal to stabilize completely. Tomorrow morning we will remove the mold and see if you have made a bell or just an expensive mistake. The rest of the day was spent in preparation for the second bell, the bell of strength, which would be larger and require more metal, more heat, more precision. Thomas walked Daniel through the process of building a bigger mold, showing him how to reinforce the wood so it could withstand the pressure of molten bronze without warping. They worked in companionable silence, the old man's hands guiding but not doing, teaching through demonstration and then stepping back to let Daniel figure out the details himself. Lunch was bread and cheese again, eaten standing up because neither man wanted to leave the work. Ranger got his share, the dog finally eating after Daniel took the first bite, this small ritual of shared survival that had become their language when words were insufficient. As afternoon bled into evening, Father Michael returned, this time bringing with him a woman Daniel had not met. She was maybe 60, with steel gray hair, cut short and practical, wearing a canvas jacket over denim, work boots that had seen actual work. Her handshake was firm enough to test his grip, her eyes measuring him with the frank assessment of someone who made her living reading people. Catherine Reeves, she introduced herself. I run the Historical Society here in Northwind. Father Michael tells me you are attempting to revive this place. Daniel glanced at Thomas, who had settled into his chair near the forge, hands wrapped around a cup of tea. I am attempting to cast 7 bells. Whether that revives anything remains to be seen. Catherine walked the perimeter of the foundry, running her hand over tools and molds, and the bells that hung like a congregation of silent witnesses. This building is listed on the State Historic Register, she said. That gives it some protection. But protection is only as good as the money backing it. If Thomas dies and the foundry goes to probate, the historical status becomes a suggestion rather than a requirement. She stopped in front of the 7 molds lined up on the workbench. These bells you are making, if you succeed, they become part of the foundry's historical record. They prove this is still an active facility, not just a museum. That matters for legal purposes. Thomas spoke from his chair, voice carrying despite his frailty. Catherine is the reason this place is still standing. She has fought off 3 attempts to have it condemned as structurally unsound. And I will fight off a 4th if necessary, Catherine said. But I cannot fight forever. We need new blood. Someone with the strength to hold the line when the developers come. She looked directly at Daniel. Father Michael says you are military, EOD, that you know how to stay calm when things are about to explode. Daniel almost smiled at the metaphor. I know how to cut wires. Not sure that translates to fighting City Hall. It translates to having steady hands and a clear head under pressure. That is more than most people manage. She pulled out a business card, handed it to him. When Robert Brennan shows up, and he will show up, call me. Do not try to handle him alone. He is good at making reasonable arguments for unreasonable things. The name again, Robert Brennan. Daniel looked at Thomas, who had gone still, his face unreadable. Who is he? What does he want with this place? Thomas set down his cup slowly, as if the weight of the answer required both hands free. He wants to erase what my brother died for. That is all you need to know for now. That is not enough, Daniel pressed. If I am walking into a fight, I need to know what I am fighting against. Thomas closed his eyes, and for a moment, Daniel thought he had pushed too hard, thought the old man would retreat into silence. But when Thomas spoke again, his voice was steady, carved from some deep reservoir of will. Robert Brennan was a captain in the Army during Vietnam. He commanded an infantry unit, good men, boys really, most of them 19 or 20 years old. In 1972, his unit was ambushed outside Da Nang. 12 men died. Robert survived. He came home decorated, honorable discharge, the kind of record that opens doors. But something in him died with those 12 boys, and what grew back was not the same thing. Thomas opened his eyes, staring at something beyond the walls. My brother William knew Robert. They were stationed at the same base for a time. William was civilian personnel, classified essential, working on acoustic projects for the military. Robert came to him with a request. He wanted William to build a sonic weapon, something that could disorient enemy combatants, give his men an advantage. William refused, said it went against everything he believed bells were meant to be. 2 weeks later, William disappeared. Robert filed the missing persons report himself. Very concerned, very helpful, very convincing. You think Robert killed him, Daniel said. It was not a question. Thomas shook his head slowly. I think Robert drove him to it. I think the pressure, the accusations of being unpatriotic, of having blood on his hands by refusing to help, I think it crushed William, and I think Robert knew it would. Maybe did not plan it that way. Maybe did not want it to end like that. But he lit the match and then acted surprised when everything burned. Catherine added quietly. Robert came back to Northwind 5 years ago, made a fortune in real estate development out west, buying up small towns and turning them into resort communities. High-end, expensive, exclusive. He says he wants to honor his roots, give back to the place where he grew up. But what he really wants is to bury his guilt under enough concrete and glass that he does not have to see it anymore. Father Michael, who had been silent until now, spoke up. I have known Robert since we were boys. He was not always what he is now. The war did something to him. Those 12 deaths did something to him. He believes that if he had been given better tools, better weapons, those men would have lived. He has spent 50 years convincing himself that William's refusal was the reason they died. It is not rational, but grief rarely is. Daniel absorbed this, turning it over in his mind, fitting it against his own experience with guilt and blame, and the ways men rewrite history to make themselves either heroes or villains, because those roles are easier than accepting that sometimes terrible things just happen, and no one is quite innocent, and no one is quite guilty either. He thought about his son, about the choice to retire early, about Sarah's words at the funeral. You should have been there. Maybe she was right. Maybe he should have been. But he was not, and Ryan was dead, and all the shooting in the world would not resurrect what had been lost. When does he usually show up, Daniel asked. Catherine checked her watch. Based on previous patterns, within the next hour. He likes to come unannounced, likes to catch people off guard, make them feel reactive instead of prepared. She was right. 40 minutes later, headlights cut through the gathering dark outside, sweeping across the foundry's front windows. An engine shut off. A car door closed with the solid thunk of German engineering. Footsteps approached, confident and unhurried. The door opened without a knock. The man who entered was tall, maybe 6'2", with shoulders that had stayed broad despite 60 years of gravity trying to pull them down. His hair was silver, combed back from a face that was handsome in the way that aging athletes stay handsome, all sharp lines and weathered leather, and eyes that calculated angles before committing to movement. He wore a wool overcoat over a suit that cost more than Daniel's truck, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine despite the snow outside. Thomas, the man said, his voice warm and familiar, pitched to suggest they were old friends catching up instead of adversaries circling. I heard you were still breathing. Good for you. Stubbornness must be hereditary. Robert, Thomas replied, not standing, not offering hospitality. Come to measure the property for demolition plans? Robert smiled. It was a practiced expression calibrated to suggest amusement without committing to joy. I come to check on an old friend. Make sure you have everything you need. These winters are hard on men our age. His gaze shifted to Daniel, assessing him the way a general assesses terrain before committing troops. And you must be the stranger everyone is talking about. Small town, news travels, Daniel Cross, EOD, retired. Saved Thomas from freezing to death. Very heroic. He extended a hand. Robert Brennan. Daniel stood but did not take the offered hand, just passing through. Robert lowered his hand smoothly, unfazed. Of course. No one ever plans to stay in Northwind. It is the kind of place you pass through on your way to somewhere better. He turned his attention back to Thomas. I heard rumors you are attempting to cast bells again, at your age, with your health. That seems optimistic. Thomas met his gaze steadily. Optimism is all I have left. That in spite. Robert laughed, a sound like ice cracking. Well, spite I understand. It has kept me going longer than I care to admit. He walked deeper into the foundry, looking around with the casual entitlement of someone who already considered the space his. This place could be something beautiful, you know. A boutique hotel, luxury accommodations with rustic charm. People would pay top dollar to stay in a converted foundry. Keep some of the bells as decoration. Historic ambiance. Everyone wins. Everyone except the bells, Thomas said. Bells are metal, Robert countered. Metal does not care what happens to it. People care. Living people who need jobs and opportunities and reasons to believe their town has a future beyond poverty and nostalgia. Catherine stepped forward. The foundry is historically protected. You know this. We have been over it a dozen times. Protection is a flexible concept, Robert said mildly, especially when balanced against economic development and public good. There are legal mechanisms for overriding historical status if the community benefit is significant enough. I have lawyers who specialize in exactly that kind of flexibility. Father Michael spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to speaking for higher powers than courts and contracts. What you are describing is erasure, Robert. Wiping out 140 years of craftsmanship to build something that will be obsolete in 20. That is not progress. That is vandalism with a business plan. Robert turned to face the priest, and for a moment something flickered in his expression, something that looked almost like pain before control reasserted itself. You talk about craftsmanship like it is sacred, Michael, but you know what is really sacred? Lives. The lives I could not save because I did not have the tools I needed. The lives your friend William could have saved if he had been willing to set aside his principles for one goddamn minute and help me. The words hung in the air, raw and honest in a way that made everyone in the room recalibrate. This was not a developer making cynical arguments. This was a man bleeding from a wound 50 years old that had never properly healed. William did not kill those men, Thomas said quietly. The war killed them. You were just there to witness it. Robert's jaw tightened. He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its polish, become something grittier and more real. I wake up every morning and the first thought in my head is the sound they made. 12 boys screaming in a language that is not words, just fear and pain and the knowledge that help is not coming fast enough. I have lived with that sound for 52 years. So forgive me if I do not particularly care about preserving the legacy of a man who could have helped and chose not to. Daniel understood then, understood that Robert was not a villain, just a man trying to survive his own history the only way he knew how. By building over it, covering it up, making something new that did not carry the same ghosts. It was not so different from what Daniel himself had been doing, driving across the country trying to outrun Ryan's memory. But understanding did not mean agreeing. You cannot erase guilt by destroying the things that remind you of it, Daniel said. I have tried, it follows anyway. Robert looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time, seeing past the surface to the shared territory of loss. What did you lose? My son. Afghanistan. 2 years ago. EOD. Doing the job I taught him to want. Robert nodded slowly. Then you know what it means to carry that weight. I know what it means to want to put it down, Daniel agreed. But bearing it just means you spend the rest of your life standing on top of a grave. Thomas is trying to do something different. He is trying to make the weight mean something. Give it purpose. That does not erase it, but it makes it bearable. For a moment, something in Robert's face shifted, softened, as if the man he used to be was trying to surface through the layers of armor and anger. Then it passed, and the developer returned, smooth and implacable. Philosophical talk does not change reality. Thomas is dying. This foundry is dying with him. You can either accept a generous offer for the property now while you still have leverage, or you can watch it get taken for back taxes and code violations after he is gone. Those are your options. There is a third option, Catherine said. Daniel successfully casts 7 bells and inherits the property as a going concern. Then it is his choice what happens here, not yours. Robert smiled that practiced smile again. 7 bells in 2 weeks? Cast by someone who has never made a bell in his life? Under the instruction of a man who can barely stand? He shook his head. That is not an option. That is a fantasy. Thomas spoke from his chair, each word deliberate and weighted. My brother spent 7 years learning to cast bells, but when he finally understood what he was doing, he cast his masterpiece in a single day. Skill is not about time. It is about attention. And this man, he gestured to Daniel, has spent his entire adult life paying the kind of attention that keeps people alive. He will cast the bells, and when he does, you will have to find somewhere else to bury your ghosts. Robert looked at Thomas for a long moment, and Daniel could see the history between them, decades of resentment and grief and complicated feelings that had calcified into this cold standoff. Finally, Robert nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. We will see. He turned toward the door, then paused. I genuinely hope you succeed, Thomas. I hope you get your legacy and your vindication and all the things you have been chasing since William died. But hope does not change the math. You have 2 weeks. I have time and money and the law. We both know how this ends. He left, the door closing behind him with a finality that felt like punctuation at the end of a sentence no one wanted to finish. In the silence that followed, Ranger padded over to Daniel and leaned against his leg, offering the simple comfort of presence. Daniel rested his hand on the dog's head and looked at the first mold sitting on the workbench, cooling, holding inside it the first bell he had ever cast, which would either ring true or prove Robert right. Father Michael broke the silence. He means well, you know, in his own broken way. He is just trying to survive the only way he knows how. That does not make him right, Catherine said. No, Michael agreed, but it makes him human. That is worth remembering. Thomas pushed himself to his feet, using his cane for support. Tomorrow we will know if Daniel has the gift. Tomorrow we open the mold and discover if the bell of listening was listening to what we were trying to teach it. He looked at Daniel. Get some rest. Tomorrow is the day everything changes or everything ends. Might as well sleep while you still can. Daniel nodded. He made his way to the back room, Ranger following, and lay down on the cot without bothering to undress. Through the walls he could hear the others talking, their voices low and serious, discussing strategies and timelines and the thousand variables that separated success from failure. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep but found himself replaying Robert's words. The sound they made, 12 boys screaming. He knew that sound, had heard it in his nightmares for 2 years. Ryan's voice calling for help that came seconds too late. The guilt of survival when the people you were supposed to protect did not. Maybe Robert was right. Maybe there was no good way to carry that kind of weight. But Thomas was right too. You could not erase it by running from it or building over it or pretending it did not exist. You could only try to turn it into something else, something that honored the dead by helping the living. That was what bells did, Thomas had said. They remembered. They witnessed. They called people together when everything else pushed them apart. Daniel opened his eyes in the darkness and spoke to the dog lying beside him. We will cast the bells, all 7, and when we do, we will prove that some things are worth more than money or grief or 50 years of trying to forget. We will prove that legacy is not about escaping the past. It is about giving it a future. Ranger's tail thumped once against the cot. It was enough. Morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of December day where sunlight turned snow into fields of scattered diamonds, and every breath burned going down. Daniel woke before dawn and found Thomas already at the forge, stoking coals, preparing for the moment when they would open the first mold and discover what lived inside. The others arrived in a silent procession. Father Michael, Catherine, even a few townspeople who had heard rumors and wanted to witness either a resurrection or a funeral. They stood in a semicircle around the workbench where the mold sat, its wooden exterior dark and unremarkable, giving no hint of what it contained. Thomas handed Daniel a chisel and a wooden mallet. The mold must be broken to free the bell. There is no other way. Be gentle but decisive. Hesitation is what cracks bronze. Daniel positioned the chisel at the seam where the two halves of the mold joined. He tapped once lightly, testing. The wood held. He tapped harder. A crack appeared. Harder still, and the seam began to split, sawdust falling away, revealing the bronze underneath. He worked methodically, splitting the mold piece by piece, letting the halves fall away like a chrysalis, revealing what had transformed inside. And then it was there, the bell. Small, no bigger than a teacup, its surface smooth and unadorned except for the natural variations in the bronze, subtle color shifts from rose gold to darker amber, where the cooling had been slowest. Thomas lifted it carefully, cradling it in both hands like something newborn. He carried it to the window where morning light poured through, held it up, examined every millimeter of its surface, looking for cracks, for air bubbles, for any flaw that would make it ring false. Finally, he nodded. It is sound. Now we discover if it sings. He placed the bell on a leather pad on the workbench, then selected a small brass striker from a drawer. He positioned himself, took a breath, and struck the bell once firmly at the point where the metal was thickest. The sound that emerged was clear and pure and perfect, 256 hertz exactly. Middle C, the note that every other note measured itself against. It rang for 10 seconds, 15, 20, the tone never wavering, never faltering, sustaining itself on nothing but the truth of its own construction. When it finally faded to silence, Thomas looked at Daniel with an expression that was equal parts relief and pride and something that might have been hope. You have the gift. The metal listened. It heard what you were trying to tell it. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest, some knot of tension he had been carrying since he arrived. He had done it, cast a bell that rang true, 1 down, 6 to go. The rest of the day was spent preparing the second mold, the bell of strength, which would be twice the size and require twice the precision. Thomas taught him how to reinforce the wood, how to calculate the additional metal needed, how to adjust his pouring technique to account for the increased volume. They cast it that evening, working by lamplight, the forge glowing like a sunrise contained in brick. The metal flowed smooth and hot, filling the mold without flaw. And when it was done, Daniel felt the same exhausted satisfaction that came after a successful EOD mission. the knowledge that he had done something dangerous and necessary and done it right. That night, after the others had left and Thomas had retreated to his room, Daniel found himself unable to sleep. He wandered the foundry, looking at the thousands of bells hanging in the shadows, each one a voice waiting to be heard. He thought about what Thomas had said about permanence, about truth that did not change, about making something that would outlast everyone who remembered why it mattered. Near the back wall, behind a shelf of rusted tools, he found a wooden crate he had not noticed before. It was old, the wood water stained and warped, but when he opened it, he found something unexpected. A cassette tape, the kind that was ancient even when he was young. It sat in a plastic case, unlabeled except for a piece of masking tape across the front, with 2 words written in faded ink. For James. James, his father's name. Daniel's hands shook as he lifted the tape. There was an old cassette player on the workbench, covered in dust, but probably still functional. He carried the tape over, wiped down the player, inserted the cassette, and pressed play. Static hissed for a few seconds. Then a voice emerged, male, tired but calm, speaking with the careful precision of someone who knows they are running out of time to say something important. James, if you are hearing this, it means I am gone and you somehow found your way to this place. I am recording this in December of 1972, 3 days before I plan to do something that will either save everything I believe in or destroy me. Either way, I wanted you to know the truth. The military came to me 6 months ago. They wanted me to build a weapon, a sonic disruptor, something that could incapacitate enemy soldiers without killing them. They showed me the science. It was sound, pun intended. It would have worked, but I refused. Not because I doubted the technology, but because I understood what it would become. Today's non-lethal weapon is tomorrow's instrument of torture. Today's precision tool is tomorrow's blunt object. I have spent my life making bells that call people together. I will not spend my death making tools that drive them apart. They called it treason. Said I had American blood on my hands. Said boys were dying because I was too principled to help. Maybe they were right. Maybe my refusal did cost lives. But I have to believe that some things matter more than survival. That integrity is not just what you do when people are watching. It is what you do when no one will ever know, and it costs you everything. I am hiding my work, James. All of it. The bells I was making, the techniques I developed, the acoustic discoveries that could change how we understand sound itself. I am putting it all beneath the lake, where no one can find it unless they are willing to dive deep and risk drowning. If your son ever reads this, if he somehow becomes the person I am trusting to finish what I started, tell him this. Bells are not weapons. They are witnesses. They do not destroy. They remember. They do not divide. They call. Make them understand that. Make them hear it. The tape clicked off. Daniel sat in the darkness, his father's name echoing in his head. James Cross, the man who had taught him to work with his hands, to measure twice and cut once, to understand that precision mattered and details saved lives. The man who had died when Daniel was 17, a heart attack at 50, sudden and absolute, leaving behind more questions than answers about who he had been before he became a father. And now this, proof that James had known William Whitmore, had been trusted by him, had been part of something Daniel was only now beginning to understand. He rewound the tape, played it again, listening for clues he might have missed. Then a third time, and it was on the third listening that he heard it, in the background, almost inaudible beneath William's voice, another sound, metal striking metal, rhythmic, deliberate, a pattern, 3 slow strikes, pause, 2 fast strikes, pause, 3 slow, pause, 1 final strike. Ranger, sleeping near the forge, suddenly lifted his head. His ears pricked forward, and then he barked. 3 times. Slow. The same pattern he used to signal danger. Daniel's skin prickled. He looked at the dog, then back at the tape player. He rewound it, played just the last few seconds where the pattern was clearest. Ranger barked again. 3 slow, 2 fast, 3 slow, 1 final. It was a code. William had embedded a message in the recording, hidden beneath his words, meant for someone who would know how to listen. Someone whose father had taught them Morse code during long summer evenings when most kids were learning to throw baseballs. Someone like Daniel. He grabbed a pen and paper, played the sequence again. Translating. 3 slow strikes was O, 2 fast was I, 3 slow was O, 1 final was E. OE, it meant nothing. Unless it was not Morse code but something else. A frequency pattern, a coordinate, a combination. Daniel looked at the 7 molds lined up on the workbench, looked at the numbers burned into their wood. 1 through 7. Then he understood. The pattern was telling him the order. 0 was 8, which did not exist yet. I was 9, O was 15, E was 5. 8, 9, 15, 5. Coordinates, or a date, or a combination to something locked. He stood, pulse racing, and went to find Thomas. The old man was awake, sitting in his chair near the cold forge, wrapped in blankets, looking like he had aged another decade since morning. But when Daniel explained what he had found, what he had heard, Thomas's eyes went sharp and clear. William left a message, Thomas said. After 52 years, my brother is still talking, still trying to tell us where to look. He reached for his cane, pushed himself to his feet. There is a lake map in the drawer. Get it. Daniel found the map, spread it on the workbench. Thomas pointed with one shaking finger to a spot on the southern end of Northwind Lake. Here. This is where his workshop went down. The coordinates would be, he traced his finger, approximately latitude 48.915, longitude 93.505. He looked up at Daniel. 8, 9, 15, 5. Not all 4 numbers, just the last 4 digits of each coordinate. He marked the position. There, that is where we need to dive. Daniel stared at the map, at the X that marked the spot where William Whitmore had hidden his life's work beneath 15 feet of frozen water. The proof that would either save this foundry or condemn it. The legacy that had been waiting half a century for someone to care enough to listen. He looked at Ranger, who sat watching him with those knowing amber eyes. Then he looked at Thomas, who waited with the patience of a man who had already waited 52 years and could wait a little longer. All right, Daniel said, we dive, but first we finish the bells. All 7. Because if William trusted my father, then I am going to trust him. We do this right, in order. No shortcuts. Thomas nodded slowly. That is exactly what he would have wanted, what he would have expected. He sat back down, suddenly exhausted, the brief surge of energy fading. Tomorrow we cast the bell of precision, the one that teaches that being close is not close enough. That almost is just another word for failure. If you can make that one sing, the rest will follow. Daniel returned to his room but did not sleep. He lay in the darkness, the cassette tape playing over and over in his head, his father's name and William's voice and the pattern of bells that had waited decades to be understood. He thought about legacy, about the things fathers left behind for sons to discover, about the way the dead kept teaching long after their voices had faded, if only the living were willing to listen. Ranger shifted beside him, and Daniel reached out, resting his hand on the dog's warm flank, feeling the steady rise and fall of breath that meant something lived and endured and refused to quit. We are going to finish this, Daniel whispered into the dark. For Ryan, for James, for William, for all of them who deserve better than to be forgotten. The dog's tail thumped once, just once, but it was enough. Outside, snow began to fall again, and beneath the frozen surface of Northwind Lake, 15 feet down, where light barely reached, a workshop waited in the cold and the dark. Waited for someone brave enough, or foolish enough, or desperate enough to believe that some things were worth diving for, even if you were not sure you would make it back to the surface. Even if all you had was a broken bell, a dead man's voice, and the kind of faith that looked like madness until it looked like a miracle. The second bell emerged from its mold, like something born rather than made, the bronze still warm to the touch, its surface catching morning light and throwing it back in shades of amber and rose gold. Daniel lifted it carefully, feeling its weight settle into his hands with the solidity of something that knew its own purpose. The bell of strength, 388 hertz. Larger than the first, heavy enough to require both hands to hold steady, its walls thicker to withstand the force of its own resonance. Thomas struck it once with the brass mallet, and the sound that emerged was deeper than the first bell, more visceral, a note you felt in your sternum before you heard it with your ears. It sustained for 30 seconds, the vibration traveling through the air like ripples on water, and when it finally faded, Thomas nodded with the satisfaction of a teacher watching a student grasp something essential. 2 bells sing true. 5 remain. The old man's voice was stronger this morning. fueled by progress or stubbornness or some combination of both. But his hands shook more than yesterday, and the way he lowered himself into his chair suggested bones grinding against joints that had forgotten how to cooperate. You have 9 days, Daniel. 9 days to cast 5 bells, each one more difficult than the last. The math is not in your favor. Math never is, Daniel replied, setting the bell on the growing line that would eventually become a scale, an octave, a promise kept or broken. He looked at the remaining molds, each one slightly larger than the last, each demanding more metal, more heat, more precision. But I have worked with worse odds. The door opened, bringing with it a gust of December wind and a man Daniel had not seen before. He was maybe 48, broad-shouldered and lean, in the way that came from physical labor rather than Jim's, with a shaved head and a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his hairline. He wore a canvas jacket over thermal layers, work boots caked with mud and snow, and he carried himself with the careful balance of someone who had learned to move quietly in places where noise meant death. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the foundry with the methodical scan of a man trained to assess threats and exits. His eyes found Daniel, held there, and something passed between them. Recognition not of faces but of type. Soldier seeing soldier. The posture, the scars, the way they both stood with weight slightly forward, ready to move in any direction without thinking about it first. Heard you might need help, the man said. His voice was gravel and smoke, the kind that came from years of shouting orders over gunfire. Name is Marcus Stone, Marine Corps, Iraq. 2 tours, retired or whatever you call it when they decide you have been broken enough to send home. Thomas looked up from his tea. Who told you we needed help? Father Michael said there was a veteran trying to cast 7 bells in less than 2 weeks and that only a fool or a madman would attempt it alone. The man's mouth twitched into something that was not quite a smile. I have been both. Figured I would see if I could be useful. Daniel studied him, seeing past the surface to the damage underneath. The way Marcus stood with his weight favoring his right leg. The way his left hand had a tremor he tried to hide by keeping it in his pocket. The way his eyes moved constantly, tracking movement that was not there. Watching for threats that existed only in the muscle memory of combat. What can you do? Daniel asked. Weld. Fabricate. Work metal hot or cold. Did maintenance on everything from Humvees to artillery. He pulled his left hand from his pocket, holding it steady through visible effort. Also got this. Nerve damage, shrapnel. Makes fine work difficult, but I can still swing a hammer and hold a mold steady. If that is useful, I stay. If not, I walk. Thomas looked at Daniel, deferring the decision. This was Daniel's challenge now. His choice who to trust and who to turn away. Daniel nodded toward the forge. 3rd bell cast tomorrow. Bell of precision, 424 hertz. It is the one that requires the steadiest pour, no variation in flow, no hesitation. I could use someone who knows metal, someone who understands that close enough gets people killed. Marcus's expression shifted, something easing in his shoulders. When do we start? Now. They worked through the day, like men who had learned long ago that words were optional when hands could speak. Marcus proved his competence within the first hour, moving around the forge with the fluid efficiency of someone who had spent years in spaces where everything had a place and disorder meant death. He reinforced the 3rd mold without being asked, anticipating what would be needed before Daniel had to explain it. He prepared the crucible, measured the alloy, adjusted the forge temperature with small, precise movements that spoke of experience earned in fire and pressure. By evening, they had cast the bell of precision, the pour executed so smoothly it looked like choreography, 2 men moving in silent coordination, one pouring while the other steadied the mold, both understanding that the margin between success and failure was measured in fractions of seconds and degrees of temperature. When the bronze settled and began its slow cooling, Marcus stepped back, wiping sweat from his head, and for the first time since arriving, he smiled. A real smile, small but genuine. That felt good, he said quietly. Felt like something that mattered. Daniel understood. After war, after the adrenaline and purpose and clarity of mission, civilian life could feel like walking through water, every action muted and meaningless. But this, making something with fire and skill and hands that remembered how to work, this was a kind of peace that did not require you to pretend the war had not happened. It lets you be who you were, scars and all, and still contribute something worth keeping. The next morning brought another visitor. This one was older, maybe 55, Asian, Vietnamese Daniel guessed from the accent that colored his English with tones and rhythms that belonged to a different linguistic tradition. He was missing his left hand, the sleeve of his jacket folded and pinned at the elbow, but his right hand was calloused and strong, and he carried a canvas bag full of woodworking tools that looked like they had been maintained with religious devotion. Tommy Chen, the man introduced himself. Navy, 72 to 75, boat mechanic, lost the hand to a rope and a winch that did not know when to stop. He set his bag down, looked around the foundry, and nodded as if confirming something he had suspected. Father Michael said, "You need molds reinforced. I build things from wood, furniture mostly, but I know how to make joints that hold and structures that do not warp under stress. If you have wood and plans, I can make it work." Thomas pulled out a sheet of paper, a hand-drawn schematic of the final 3 molds. These are more complex than the first 4. They need internal supports, channels for air to escape, precision joints that can withstand 1200-degree bronze without buckling. Can you build them with one hand? Tommy looked at the plans, then at his tools, then back at Thomas. Can you cast bells while dying? Fair point, Thomas conceded. They worked through the next 2 days in a rhythm that felt less like collaboration and more like communion. 4 men and a dog moving through the foundry with the coordinated purpose of a unit that had learned to function as a single organism. Marcus handled the heavy lifting, the movement of crucibles and ingots, and the kind of labor that required strength and endurance. Tommy shaped wood with tools adapted for one-handed use, his movements economical and precise, creating supports and channels that look like art but serve pure function. Daniel managed the pores, the chemistry, the temperature controls that separated bells from scrap metal. And Thomas, growing frailer by the day but refusing to yield entirely to weakness, supervised and instructed and carried in his voice the accumulated wisdom of 7 generations. Ranger moved among them like a benediction, sitting near whoever was working, offering the silent support of presence. The dog had begun to eat regularly again, had stopped whining in his sleep, had found in this makeshift pack something that resembled the structure and purpose he had lost when Ryan died. Daniel watched the transformation and felt something similar happening in himself. The guilt was still there, would always be there, but it was no longer the only thing. There was also this, the work, the men, the slow accumulation of bells that might add up to something worth remembering. On the 6th day, as they prepared to cast the bell of sacrifice, Father Michael arrived with news. Robert Brennan was asking questions around town. Who was helping at the foundry? What progress was being made? Whether the bells were actually ringing true, or if this was all theater and desperation. He is positioning himself, Catherine had come with Michael, her face serious. Building a narrative that you are wasting time and resources on a vanity project while the foundry continues to deteriorate. He has filed paperwork with the county, safety inspections, environmental assessments, building code violations. Even if you succeed in casting the bells, he is creating a legal framework to claim the property as uninhabitable and should be seized for public welfare. Can he do that? Marcus asked. With enough money and the right lawyers, he can do almost anything, Catherine replied. We need to document everything. Photographs, video, testimony from people who have been here, who have seen the work. We need to prove this is a legitimate revival of a historic craft, not just an old man's fantasy. They spent that afternoon documenting, cameras recording the process of casting the 4th bell, the bell of sacrifice, which Thomas had insisted be made partially from bronze melted down from his own military medals. 3 purple hearts and a silver star, earned in Korea, now transformed into an alloy that would sing for generations after the citations and ribbons had turned to dust. When the metal was molten, Thomas had stood with difficulty and spoken words that sounded like prayer or testimony or both. These medals mark moments when I chose to bleed instead of retreat, when I put the mission above myself. That is what sacrifice means, not dying for something, living for it, carrying it forward even when the weight crushes you. He looked at Daniel, then Marcus, then Tommy. You 3 understand this. You have all carried weight that tried to break you. Now we turn that weight into sound, into memory, into something that calls others forward instead of dragging them down. The pour had been solemn, reverent almost, And when the bell cooled and was struck for the first time, the note that emerged was complex and layered, harmonics folding over each other like voices in a choir. 360 hertz. But within that frequency were echoes of other tones, ghosts of the metal's previous form, sacrifice transformed but not erased. That night, after the others had left, Daniel found himself unable to sleep again. He walked the foundry's perimeter, checking locks, testing windows, the old EOD habits of securing a perimeter before rest. He was near the back door when he heard it, an engine, low and steady, a vehicle approaching with headlights off, navigating by moonlight and memory. He moved to the window, staying in shadow, and watched as a panel van stopped 50 yards from the foundry. Two figures emerged, both wearing dark clothing, their movements quick and purposeful. They approached the building's south side, where the oldest wall showed its age in cracked mortar and loose bricks. One of them carried something, a jerry can, gasoline or kerosene, the universal language of arson for hire. Daniel did not hesitate. He grabbed his jacket, signaled Ranger to stay silent, and slipped out the front door, circling wide to approach from their blind side. The men were focused on their task, one pouring liquid at the base of the wall, while the other prepared what looked like a road flare, the kind designed to burn hot and fast and leave minimal evidence. Military training took over. Daniel closed the distance in seconds, low and fast, tackling the man with the flare before he could strike it. They went down hard, Daniel's weight driving the air from the man's lungs, his hands finding and controlling the wrists with practiced efficiency. The second man spun, reaching for something in his jacket, but Ranger was already there, teeth bared, a growl that was all threat and no bluff. "Do not," Daniel said quietly. "The dog has killed before. He will do it again if I tell him to." The man froze, slowly raised his hands. Behind him, his partner struggled briefly, then went still under Daniel's knee. Marcus appeared from nowhere, moving with the silent grace of someone who had done this in darker places with higher stakes. He had a length of pipe in his right hand, his left hand trembling, but his grip solid. "I heard the engine. Figured you might need backup." Between them, they secured both men with zip ties Marcus produced from his jacket, then marched them around front where the foundry's lights provided enough illumination to see faces. They were young, maybe mid-20s, with the look of men who took cash to not ask questions, not professionals, just desperate or greedy or both. "Who sent you?" Daniel asked. The men stayed silent. Daniel picked up the flare that had fallen during the tackle. It was heavy duty, the kind used for emergency road marking, capable of burning at 3,000 degrees. He held it up. This would have taken the wall down in minutes. Old wood, dry conditions. The whole foundry goes up, maybe takes half the block with it. He leaned close. "So I will ask again. Who sent you?" The first man broke. Guy named Brennan. Offered $5,000. Said the building was abandoned. Said no one would get hurt. We did not know people were inside. We would not have. I swear we would not. Marcus pulled out his phone. "I am calling the sheriff. Arson for hire. Attempted destruction of a historic building. You boys are looking at federal charges." "Wait," the second man said. "Brennan said this was legal. Said he had permits to demolish. Said we were just like accelerating an approved process." "Then Brennan lied to you," Daniel replied. "And now you get to choose. You can tell the sheriff everything Brennan told you, every conversation, every payment, and maybe you walk away with probation. Or you can stay loyal to a man who sent you to commit a felony and spend the next 5 years in prison. Your choice." The sheriff arrived 20 minutes later, a woman in her 50s with gray hair in a tight bun and eyes that had seen enough small-town crime to not be surprised by much. She took statements, arrested both men, and promised Daniel she would be having a conversation with Robert Brennan first thing in the morning. "This gives us leverage," she said as she loaded the arsonist into her cruiser. "Attempted arson, conspiracy, reckless endangerment. Even if Brennan claims he did not explicitly order them to set the fire, his name and money are all over this. That is enough for a warrant and an investigation." After she left, Daniel and Marcus stood in the cold, adrenaline still humming in their veins, breath forming clouds in the frozen air. Ranger sat between them, alert but calm, having fulfilled his function and now waiting for the next command. Marcus spoke first. "In Iraq, we had a saying, the only thing more dangerous than your enemy is a desperate enemy. Brennan is getting desperate. Then we are getting close, Daniel said. Close enough to make him panic. They went back inside. Thomas was awake, sitting by the forge, having heard enough through the walls to understand what had happened. His face was pale, his hands shaking worse than before, but his voice was steady. He came after the foundry. That means he knows you are succeeding. That means the bells are working. 4 bells complete, Daniel said. 3 remain. We have 6 days. Then we work faster, Thomas replied. The bell of memory casts tomorrow. It is the largest yet, the one that carries the most weight. Literally and metaphorically. He looked at each man in turn. This bell is made for remembering, for carrying forward the names and stories of those who should not be forgotten. I want each of you to bring something, a name, a memory, something you need the bell to hold because you cannot hold it alone anymore. The next morning before the casting, they stood in a circle around the forge. Thomas went first, pulling from his pocket a folded piece of paper worn soft from decades of handling. My brother William, who chose integrity over survival, who believed some things mattered more than fear. I want him remembered not for how he died, but for why he lived. Father Michael, who had arrived early, spoke next, James Cross, Daniel's father. A man who understood that being a father meant teaching your son not to be like you, but to be better than you. He succeeded. Tommy Chen laid a photograph on the workbench, yellowed, creased, showing 6 men in Navy uniforms, young and smiling, standing on a ship's deck with the ocean behind them. My crew, only 2 of us made it home. I want them remembered as they were, not as they died. Marcus pulled a letter from his jacket, the paper stained and tattered. From a Marine named Rodriguez, killed by an IED. I was supposed to clear, but got to 5 minutes too late. He wrote this to his daughter the day before he died. Never got sent. I want him remembered as a father, not a casualty. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out the dog tags. Ryan's name stamped into metal. Corporal Ryan Cross, who died doing a job I taught him to want, who deserved better than a father who chose safety over showing him how to stay alive. I want him remembered as someone who mattered, who still matters. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of collective grief and love and unfinished business filling the space between them. Then Thomas nodded. Into the bell they go, not the physical objects, but what they represent. We will speak each name as the bronze flows. Give them voice again. That is what memory does. It speaks for those who cannot. The casting of the bell of memory was different from the others. As Daniel poured, each man spoke a name aloud. William, James, Rodriguez, the 6 sailors from Tommy's photograph. Ryan. Others too. Names they had carried silently, privately, now released into bronze that would hold them when flesh and memory failed. The metal filled the mold, and the names filled the foundry, echoing off walls and bells and the bones of a building that had spent a century and a half listening to what people needed to say when words were not enough. When the bell cooled and was struck, it rang at 405 hertz, and within that tone were layers of complexity that seemed impossible from a single piece of metal. Harmonics and overtones and frequencies that wove together into something that sounded almost like voices. Not words, not language, but communication nonetheless. The bell sang, and in its singing was the proof that Thomas had been right. Some things lasted, some things refused to be forgotten. That afternoon, Robert Brennan arrived with his lawyer and a sheriff's deputy. Not the sheriff from last night, but a younger man, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. Robert looked haggard, older than he had seemed during his first visit, the kind of aging that happens overnight when consequences finally arrive. The lawyer spoke first, reading from a prepared statement. My client wishes to clarify that he had no knowledge of any illegal activities undertaken by contractors he had hired for preliminary assessment work. He has cooperated fully with the sheriff's investigation and has provided all requested documentation. He maintains that his interest in this property is purely commercial and within legal bounds. Catherine Reeves had arrived with her own recording device, documenting everything. That sounds like a prepared statement designed to limit liability while admitting nothing. Perhaps Mr. Brennan would like to speak for himself. Robert waved his lawyer quiet. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the 5 bells lined up on the workbench, each one reflecting light differently, each one carrying its own frequency and purpose. His shoulders sagged, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of the polish from before. I need to say something. He turned away from the lawyer, from the deputy, and when his eyes met Thomas's, something in him broke open. I came to apologize. Not for my interest in the property, that is business, but for everything else. For 52 years of trying to destroy something I never understood. He moved to stand before Thomas's chair, and his hands were shaking. That last conversation I had with William, before he disappeared. I need you to know what I said to him. He took a breath that sounded ragged. I did not just ask him to build a weapon. I told him that every soldier who died because he refused to help, their blood was on his hands. I told him he was a coward, that he was hiding behind principles while real men bled. I told him that history would forget him and remember only that he could have saved lives and chose not to. Thomas sat very still, his face unreadable. Robert's voice cracked. I watched his face when I said those things. I watched something die in his eyes, like I had reached inside him and torn something essential out. And 2 days later, he was gone. He looked down at his hands. Thomas, I did not kill your brother with a gun or a knife, but I killed him with words. I pushed him into that storm. I made him feel like the only way to live with himself was to not live at all. And I have carried that for 52 years. He sank onto a crate, the lawyer hovering uncertainly. I told myself he was weak, that the guilt was his, that I was the victim. But the truth is, I was terrified. Terrified that if I admitted what I had done, I would have to face it. So I built companies, made millions, convinced myself I was honoring the men I lost by being successful. But really, I was just building monuments to my own guilt, trying to bury what I did to William under enough concrete and money that I would not have to see it anymore. Father Michael stepped forward. Robert, William's death was not murder. It was tragedy. You were both casualties of a war that destroyed more than just bodies. But I lit the fuse, Robert said. I knew he was fragile. I knew he was struggling with the decision. And I pushed anyway because I was so goddamn angry that someone would choose principles over pragmatism when my men were dying. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. I have spent 50 years hating a man for having integrity I did not understand. The foundry was silent except for the soft crackle of the forge. Thomas spoke, his voice quiet but steady. You want absolution. I cannot give you that. Only William could, and he is gone. But I can tell you what he would say if he were here. He gestured to the bells. He would say that 52 years of guilt is enough, that carrying it longer does not honor him or your men, that the only way forward is to stop building monuments to shame and start building something that actually helps people. Robert looked up, hope and doubt warring in his expression. Come back when the bells are done, Thomas said. Listen to them sing. And then, if you still want to help, we will find work for hands that know how to make things instead of destroy them. Robert nodded, unable to speak. He stood slowly, looked at each person in the room, then left with the deputy and his lawyer. The door closed behind them with a sound like an exhaled breath. Catherine spoke into the quiet. That was either the beginning of redemption or the best performance I have ever seen. It was real, Father Michael said. I have known Robert since we were boys. That was the first honest thing I have heard him say in 50 years. That evening they cast the bell of brotherhood, the sixth bell, which required 2 people to pour simultaneously, one on each side of the mold, their movements synchronized to heartbeat, pouring at the same rate, the same angle, the same pressure. Daniel and Marcus executed it flawlessly, muscle memory and trust combining into something that looked like art, but was really just 2 men who had learned in war that survival depended on functioning as pieces of a larger whole. The bell rang at 456 hertz, a tone that seemed to harmonize with itself, creating the acoustic illusion of multiple bells ringing when only one existed. It was the sound of collaboration, of individual efforts, combining into something greater than their sum. 6 bells complete, 1 remained. The bell of peace. The final tone, 512 hertz. The bell that would complete the octave or prove that completion was impossible. Thomas sat in his chair that night, wrapped in blankets despite the forge's heat, and spoke to the 4 men who had become something more than helpers. The final bell must include something from beneath the lake, from William's workshop. That is where the instruction ends. That is where faith begins. You will have to dive, recover what he left, trust that it matters. Daniel looked at the others. Marcus nodded. Tommy said simply, I cannot dive with one hand, but I can help prepare. Whatever you bring up, I can integrate it into the mold. Father Michael added, I will bless the dive. Not because I think God cares about bells specifically, but because I think he cares about people who are willing to risk themselves for something they believe matters. That is prayer, whether you call it that or not. Ranger moved to Daniel's side, pressed against his leg. The dog's amber eyes held something that looked like understanding. Or maybe just loyalty. Maybe they were the same thing. Tomorrow we dive, Daniel said. Tomorrow we find out what William left behind. What he trusted someone would eventually care enough to discover. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering Northwind in fresh white, erasing the tracks of Robert's departure and the deputy's cruiser and the attempted arson that had come within minutes of destroying everything. In 3 days, Christmas would arrive. In 3 days, Thomas would either pass the foundry to someone who deserved it or watch his family's legacy dissolve into the same forgetting that had claimed so many other small-town industries. Other crafts, other ways of life that had mattered once and then stopped mattering because no one was left who remembered why they had mattered in the first place. But tonight, 6 bells stood in a row, each one singing its own note, each one proof that memory could be made permanent if you were willing to work for it, willing to bleed for it, willing to stand in fire and heat and demand that metal remember what flesh forgot. Daniel stood at the forge, hands warm from the day's work, and thought about his son, about his father, about William Whitmore, who had walked into a storm rather than compromise what he believed, about Robert Brennan, who had spent 50 years trying to destroy what he could not understand, and only now, at the edge of his own ending, was beginning to see what he had lost. Redemption was not a single moment. It was 1,000 small choices, each one barely noticeable, each one accumulating into something that eventually looked like transformation. Maybe that was what the bells were really about. Not memory, not healing, but the evidence that people could change, could grow, could become something better than they had been if only they were willing to do the work. The forge glowed red in the darkness. The bells hung silent, waiting for their final sibling. And beneath the frozen surface of Northwind Lake, 15 feet down where the light barely reached, a workshop held its breath, patient as metal, trusting that eventually someone would arrive who understood that some things were worth diving for. Even if you were not certain you would make it back to the surface. Even if all you had was faith in foolishness, in the kind of hope that looked like insanity until it looked like a miracle. Daniel closed his eyes and imagined the dive, the cold, the dark, the pressure, the way water changed everything, made simple things complex, made breath precious, made every second count. He had done harder things. Disarmed bombs that wanted nothing more than to turn him into memory. Survived a war, buried a son, driven across half a country trying to outrun grief. Compared to that, diving into a frozen lake to recover a dead man's legacy felt almost easy. Almost. He opened his eyes and looked at Ranger, who watched him with the patience of a creature who had already decided that wherever Daniel went, he would follow, and whatever Daniel faced, they would face together. All right, Daniel whispered to the dog, to the bells, to the ghost of his son and his father and William Whitmore, to the forge and the foundry and the frozen lake beyond. Let us finish this. Tomorrow they would dive. Tonight they would rest. And the bells, 6 voices strong, would dream of the 7th that would make them complete. The lake was a sheet of silver glass under the morning sun, frozen solid for 30 yards from shore, then giving way to darker ice that creaked and groaned with the slow breathing of water trapped beneath. Daniel stood at the edge where solid ground met frozen surface, wearing a borrowed wetsuit that smelled like neoprene and old sweat, staring at the coordinates Thomas had marked on the waterproof map. 48.915 north, 93.505 west, 217 feet from shore, 15 feet down. The temperature was 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The water below the ice would be 33, just above freezing, cold enough to stop a heart in minutes if the body went into shock. Daniel had done cold water training in the Navy, knew the physiology of hypothermia, knew that survival was measured in seconds of useful consciousness before the cold turned muscle and mind to stone. But knowing and doing were separated by the distance between theory and consequence, between preparation and the moment when you stepped off solid ground into a place that wanted you dead. Marcus stood beside him, already suited up, checking the dive gear they had rented from a shop 2 towns over. The owner had asked what they were diving for. Marcus had answered simply, history. The man had not asked again. Small towns understood that some questions had answers that were none of their business. 2 tanks each, Marcus said, testing the regulators. 15 minutes of bottom time maximum. Any longer and hypothermia becomes the primary threat regardless of air supply. He looked at Daniel. You sure about this? We could wait, get professionals, people who do this for a living. We have 2 days until Christmas, Daniel replied. 2 days to finish the final bell. We do not have time for professionals. Tommy Chen had already cut a hole in the ice using a chainsaw borrowed from Father Michael, the blade screaming through frozen water, sending up plumes of white powder that caught the light like snow made of glass. The hole was 6 feet square, exposing black water beneath that looked less like liquid and more like a portal to some place where light went to die. Vapor rose from the opening, water meeting air, creating a mist that hung in the cold morning like breath from the lake itself. Ranger sat 20 feet back from the hole, watching with the intense focus of a dog who understood that what was about to happen was dangerous but necessary. The animal had not left Daniel's side since dawn, following him through breakfast, through the suiting up, through the walk from the foundry to the lake's edge. Now the dog waited, patient and alert, a silent witness to what men did when they believed something mattered more than safety. Father Michael stood near Tommy, hands folded, lips moving in what might have been prayer, or might have been the kind of internal conversation people have with themselves when words to God feel insufficient. Catherine Reeves had brought her camera, documenting everything, building the archive that would prove this was real, that it had happened, that men had risked their lives for bronze and memory, and the stubborn refusal to let the past be erased. Thomas had insisted on coming, despite his failing health, sitting in a folding chair someone had carried from the foundry, wrapped in blankets like a prophet, or a king, or just an old man who needed to see the ending he had waited 52 years to witness. His hands shook constantly now, his breathing labored, but his eyes were clear and fixed on the hole in the ice with an intensity that suggested he was seeing through it to something beyond, something that had haunted him for half a century. Daniel pulled on his hood, adjusted his mask, tested his breathing through the regulator. The air tasted metallic and cold, processed through valves and hoses, artificial but sufficient. He looked at Marcus, who gave a thumbs up. Then they stepped to the edge of the hole and without ceremony, without hesitation, dropped into the black water below. The cold was a fist that closed around his chest, squeezing out air, demanding that his body acknowledge the threat and respond with panic. But panic was trained out of EOD techs early and permanently, replaced with a kind of focused calm that allowed you to work while everything in your lizard brain screamed to run. Daniel forced himself to breathe slowly, regularly, letting his body adjust to the temperature, feeling the wetsuit's insulation do its work, creating a thin barrier between flesh and water that was the only thing keeping hypothermia at bay. He descended slowly, Marcus beside him, both following the anchor line Tommy had dropped through the hole, waited at the bottom to mark the target coordinates. The water was darker than Daniel had expected, visibility maybe 10 feet in the weak winter sunlight that penetrated the ice. Below, there was only blackness, a void that could have been 15 feet deep or 1,500. His depth gauge read at 5 feet, 10, 12. Then his fins touched something solid. He looked down and saw it. The roof of a structure, wooden beams preserved by cold water and the absence of oxygen, covered in silt but intact. William's workshop, exactly where the coordinates had promised it would be. Marcus tapped his shoulder, pointed to the right. There, maybe 15 feet away, was an opening, a doorway. The entrance to the building that had sunk in 1972 with all of William Whitmore's secrets inside. They swam toward it, moving slowly in the resistant medium of water, every motion requiring 3 times the effort it would on land. Daniel's breathing echoed in his ears, the mechanical rhythm of inhale and exhale, marking time in a place where time felt suspended, where the past had been frozen and preserved like a specimen in amber. The doorway was partially blocked by debris, but there was room to squeeze through. Daniel went first, pulling himself into the interior of the workshop, and what he found there stopped him completely. The space was intact, not just structurally sound, but preserved as if William had stepped out yesterday instead of 52 years ago. Workbenches lined the walls, tools still hanging on pegs, their metal surfaces dulled by sediment but recognizable. Glass molds sat on shelves, each one carefully labeled in handwriting that matched the letters Daniel had found. And in the center of the room, mounted on a wooden stand, was the largest bell mold Daniel had ever seen. The master bell. It was 5 feet tall, the wood reinforced with metal bands, the interior cavity visible through the split halves. And inside, still in place, was something that made Daniel's pulse quicken despite the cold trying to slow it. A crucible, sealed, waiting. Marcus appeared beside him, saw what Daniel was seeing, and even through the mask, Daniel could see his eyes widen. He made a gesture. Up. They needed to surface to tell the others, to figure out how to retrieve something this size from 15 feet underwater. But as Daniel turned to leave, his light caught something else. A box, wooden, waterproof, attached to the wall near the doorway. He swam to it, pried it open, and found inside a collection of cassette tapes, each one sealed in plastic, each one labeled with a name. James Cross, Thomas Whitmore, Robert Brennan, and one simply labeled for whoever finds this. Daniel took that tape and the one labeled for Thomas, secured them in his dive bag, then followed Marcus back through the door and up the anchor line toward the light. Breaking the surface felt like resurrection, the transition from water to air so sudden and complete that for a moment Daniel forgot how to breathe in a medium that was not filtered through a regulator. He pulled off his mask, gasped in the December cold, felt it burn his lungs in a way that was painful but proved he was alive. Marcus surfaced beside him, and together they swam to the ice edge where hands reached down to pull them out. Tommy and Father Michael hauling them from water to frozen ground, stripping off tanks, wrapping them in blankets that did nothing against the cold that had soaked through wetsuit and skin into bone. Daniel's teeth chattered so hard he could barely speak, but he managed 3 words. It is there. Everything. Thomas leaned forward in his chair, and for a moment looked 20 years younger, hope doing what medicine could not. The master bell? Daniel nodded. And more. Tapes. Instructions. He pulled the cassettes from his bag, water dripping from the sealed plastic, one for you, one for whoever finds it. They returned to the foundry where the forge had been stoked to blast furnace heat. Daniel and Marcus stood as close as they could tolerate, letting the radiant warmth drive out the cold that had settled into their cores. Ranger pressed against Daniel's legs, offering what comfort a dog could provide, which turned out to be more than most humans managed. Catherine prepared coffee strong enough to strip paint, and they drank it standing up, hands wrapped around cups that felt like they held the sun. Tommy had already begun planning the retrieval operation, sketching out a pulley system that could lift the master bell mold through the ice hole without damaging it. Father Michael stood near the cassette player, the tape Daniel had retrieved already loaded, his finger on the play button. Everyone ready? Michael asked. Thomas nodded. Daniel felt Marcus and Tommy move closer. Ranger sat at attention, as if he too understood that what came next mattered. Michael pressed play. Static hiss for several seconds. Then William Whitmore's voice emerged, older than the previous recording, tired but determined. The voice of a man recording his last will and testament. If you are hearing this, you have found the workshop. You have seen the master bell, and you are now faced with a choice that will define what happens next. The mold contains the crucible with the alloy already prepared, bronze mixed with something else, something I discovered by accident and spent 7 years perfecting. A rare earth element called neodymium, combined with trace amounts of samarium, integrated into the bronze matrix at the molecular level. This alloy, when cast into a bell and struck at the correct frequency, produces a harmonic resonance that affects human neurochemistry. It reduces cortisol, increases serotonin production, and creates what can only be described as a state of enforced calm. It is not hypnosis. It is not mind control. It is simply sound that speaks directly to the limbic system, bypassing conscious thought, creating peace where there was anxiety, hope where there was despair. The tape paused, then William continued. I have hidden this because I know what will happen if the military discovers it. Today's healing tool becomes tomorrow's weapon. Today's therapy becomes tomorrow's torture. They will use it to pacify prisoners, to control crowds, to turn medicine into oppression. And so I am making it your choice. You can retrieve the crucible, complete the master bell, and prove that sound can heal. Or you can leave it beneath the lake, sealed and forgotten, protecting it from those who would corrupt it. I cannot tell you which choice is right. I can only tell you that both choices have consequences, and you will live with them either way. My brother Thomas will want you to complete the bell. He has waited his whole life to see my work vindicated. But vindication is not the same as wisdom. Sometimes the right choice is to let the dead stay buried. Sometimes legacy is not about what you leave behind, but what you protect by keeping it hidden. Choose wisely. Choose with your conscience, not your pride. And whatever you choose, know that I trusted you enough to make the choice at all. The tape ended. Silence filled the foundry, broken only by the pop and hiss of the forge. Thomas spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. All these years, he finished it. He actually finished it. Catherine asked the question everyone was thinking. What do we do? Daniel looked at the 6 bells lined up on the workbench, each one representing a lesson, a frequency, a piece of an octave that would remain incomplete without the 7th. He thought about Ryan, about the PTSD that had driven Ranger to constant anxiety, about the veterans he had met who fought invisible wars every day against their own memories. He thought about what William's discovery could mean for them: peace, relief, a chance to carry their burdens with less pain. But he also thought about what William had warned: the military taking this technology and turning it into a weapon. Governments using it for crowd control, corporations selling forced calm to the highest bidder. The way every good thing eventually got twisted into something unrecognizable. Marcus spoke up. In Iraq, we had a program called Voice of God, directional speakers that could project sound to make people think they were hearing Allah telling them to surrender. It worked sometimes, saved lives, but it also traumatized people, made them think they were losing their minds. Good intentions, terrible consequences. He looked at Daniel. William is right to be cautious. Tommy added, my father fled Vietnam because he saw what happened when technology outpaced morality. The same tools that were supposed to help people got used to hurt them. He taught me that just because you can make something does not mean you should. Father Michael walked to the window, looked out at the lake where the workshop waited in its cold tomb. There is a reason some knowledge stays buried, not because it is dangerous in itself, but because we are not ready for it. Maybe we never will be. Thomas struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. You are talking about abandoning my brother's life work, leaving it at the bottom of a lake to rust and dissolve into nothing. After everything he sacrificed, everything he endured, you want to just walk away? Daniel met the old man's eyes. I want to make the choice William trusted us to make. The right choice, not the easy one. And you think the right choice is to let it die? I think, Daniel said slowly, that the right choice is the one we can live with tomorrow, and 10 years from tomorrow, and 50 years from tomorrow, when the consequences have had time to grow into whatever they are going to become. Catherine had been quiet, but now she spoke up. There is a middle path. We retrieve the crucible. We document everything. We seal the knowledge in an archive, accessible only to researchers who can prove they will use it ethically. We do not destroy it, but we do not unleash it either. We protect it until the world is ready. If it ever is, Marcus said quietly. If it ever is, Catherine agreed. Thomas sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him. All these years, I thought if I could just prove he was right, that his work mattered, it would mean his death was not wasted. But maybe the proof is not in completing what he started. Maybe it is in understanding why he hid it. Daniel knelt beside the old man's chair. Your brother's work does matter. It always did, but not because it created something, because it protected something. It protected the idea that some things are too important to risk corrupting. That is a legacy too. Thomas looked at him with eyes that were wet but clear. You sound like your father. James said the same things, about knowing when to act and when to wait, about understanding that patience is not weakness. The room fell silent again. Outside, the sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon, turning the snow orange and gold, making the world look like it was on fire without burning. In 2 days, Christmas would arrive. In 2 days, the challenge would be complete or failed, and Thomas Whitmore would either pass his legacy to someone worthy or watch it dissolve into the probate courts and development plans that waited like vultures for the old to finally die. We have to decide now, Catherine said. The dive team I contacted can be here tomorrow. They can retrieve the mold, the crucible, everything. But only if we tell them what to bring up and what to leave behind. Daniel stood, walked to the workbench where the 6 bells waited, lifted the smallest, the bell of listening, and struck it with the brass mallet. The tone rang out, pure and clear, and he listened, really listened, to the sound, to the silence underneath, to what his gut was telling him in the language that existed before words. He set the bell down and turned to face the others. We bring up the mold. We leave the crucible. We cast the seventh bell using conventional bronze. No rare earth elements. No neurochemistry. We complete the octave with bells that remember and witness and call people together. But we do not complete it with a bell that could be weaponized. William wanted us to choose. That is my choice. Marcus nodded immediately. I agree, Tommy said quietly. So do I. Father Michael added, the church has a saying, just because you can perform a miracle does not mean you should. Sometimes faith means trusting that the miracle will come when the time is right, not forcing it because you have the power. Catherine looked at Thomas. The decision is yours. This is your family, your brother, your foundry. The old man sat for a long time, staring at the bells, at the forge, at the 52 years of waiting and hoping and believing that had brought him to this moment. Then he nodded once slowly. Leave the crucible. Bring up the mold. We will cast the seventh bell the way my family has cast bells for 140 years, with copper and tin and fire and faith. Nothing more, nothing less. The next day brought the professional dive team, 3 people who made their living recovering things from places most humans were not meant to go. They descended into the black water with lights in winches and the casual competence of experts, and 4 hours later, they hauled the master bell mold through the ice, dripping and ancient and impossibly intact. Tommy examined it immediately, running his one hand over the wood, testing joints, checking for rot or weakness. It is sound, he announced. Better than sound. This is craftsmanship from another era. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. William built it, Thomas said. Every piece. He spent 2 years on this mold alone. They transported it to the foundry on a flatbed truck, moving slowly through Northwind streets, and people came out of shops and homes to watch. This strange procession of men carrying a piece of the past back into the present. Daniel saw faces he recognized. The sheriff, the owner of the dive shop. Others who had heard the story, who had chosen sides, who wanted to see how it ended. Robert Brennan was waiting at the foundry when they arrived. He stood near the entrance, hands in his pockets, looking smaller somehow than he had during previous visits. The expensive coat was gone, replaced with a simple canvas jacket. The polished shoes were now work boots. He looked like a man who had stopped pretending to be someone he was not. I heard about the dive, Robert said as they carried the mold inside. Heard you made a choice about the crucible. He looked at Daniel. You left it down there. Why? Because your fear was right, Daniel replied. Not right in the way you thought, but right in understanding that some things can be corrupted. That good intentions are not enough if the tools can be used for evil. Robert followed them inside, watched as they positioned the mold near the forge. I came to help, if you will have me. Thomas looked at him, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness. That would take longer. But acknowledgement, recognition that people were complicated and grief made them do terrible things, and sometimes the only way forward was to simply begin again. You know how to work a forge? I did once, 50 years ago, before the war, before everything. Robert removed his jacket. I am probably rusty, but I remember the basics. Then you can help Marcus load the coal, Thomas said. And maybe, if you are careful, you can help with the pour. They spent the next day preparing. The mold was larger than anything Daniel had attempted, requiring more metal, higher temperatures, absolute precision in every measurement. The margin for error was 0. One mistake and the bell would crack or warp or ring false, and there would be no time to start over. Christmas Eve arrived with clear skies and temperatures cold enough to make breath visible 10 feet away. The foundry was packed. Catherine and Father Michael, Tommy and Marcus, a dozen townspeople who had heard the story and wanted to witness the ending. The sheriff, who had come to make sure Robert Brennan did not cause trouble and stayed because she wanted to see if Daniel could actually pull this off. And Thomas, wrapped in blankets, sitting in his chair, looking like he might not survive to see tomorrow, but determined to survive to see tonight. Daniel stood at the forge, hands steady, mind clear. Marcus fed coal into the fire, adjusting airflow with the instinct of someone who had done this before. Robert worked beside him, rusty but competent, the two men finding a rhythm that spoke to shared understanding, if not shared history. Tommy had reinforced the mold with additional bracing, triple checking every joint, every support. Father Michael had blessed it with water from the baptismal font, not because anyone thought magic was involved, but because ritual mattered when you were doing something that mattered. The copper and tin were measured. 47 pounds of copper, 13 pounds of tin, the ratio exact. The temperature climbing toward 1085 degrees Celsius. The crucible glowing orange, then yellow, then white. Now, Thomas said. Daniel and Robert lifted the crucible together, using the special tongs designed for this weight, this heat, this moment. They moved to the mold, positioned themselves on opposite sides, and began to pour. The metal flowed like light-made liquid, filling the cavity from bottom to top, smooth and continuous. No stops, no hesitation. Daniel poured from the left, Robert from the right. Their movements synchronized without planning, without discussion, just two men understanding that this moment required them to work together or fail separately. The mold filled, the metal settled. They set the empty crucible aside and Daniel stepped back, hands shaking from adrenaline and heat and the knowledge that what they had just done could not be undone. The bell was cast. Now they could only wait to see if it would sing. 4 hours for initial cooling, then overnight for complete stabilization. Christmas morning, they would open the mold and discover if the octave was complete or if the final bell was nothing but expensive silence. People left slowly, reluctantly, as if afraid that looking away might somehow change the outcome. But eventually it was just the core group. Daniel, Marcus, Tommy, Father Michael, Catherine, Robert, Thomas, and Ranger, who had watched the entire process from his spot near the door, patient and alert, and somehow understanding that what had just happened was important. Thomas spoke into the quiet. Regardless of how this ends, you all need to know something. This foundry does not belong to me anymore. It belongs to what you built here. To the idea that men can come together across difference and division and create something that lasts. That is the real legacy. Not the bells, not the building. The people who refuse to let good things die just because dying is easier than fighting. Robert said quietly, I spent 50 years trying to bury the past. You all spent 2 weeks trying to resurrect it. I think I finally understand which approach actually works. Father Michael smiled. Resurrection is the family business. Glad you are starting to see the appeal. They kept vigil through the night, taking turns sleeping, keeping the forge warm, waiting for morning. Daniel dozed near dawn. Ranger pressed against his side and dreamed of his son. But this time Ryan was not dying. He was standing in a field of bells, each one ringing a different note, and he was smiling, telling his father it was okay, that he understood, that the guilt could finally be set down because it had been transformed into something else, something useful. Daniel woke to sunlight streaming through the foundry windows, and Thomas standing over him, looking more alive than he had in days. It is time. They gathered around the mold. Daniel picked up the chisel and mallet, took a breath, then began the careful work of splitting the wood, releasing the bell from the form that had shaped it. The mold fell away in pieces, and there, sitting on the foundry floor, was the seventh bell. It was perfect. 5 feet tall, 850 pounds of bronze that had been liquid fire yesterday and was now solid permanence. Its surface was smooth, unmarked except for the natural variations in cooling that gave it character. No cracks, no flaws. Just a bell waiting to discover if it had a voice. Tommy built a wooden frame tall enough to hang it. Marcus and Robert lifted it together, straining under the weight, settling it onto the hooks that would hold it suspended. Father Michael steadied it as they adjusted the height, making sure it hung true and level. Thomas handed Daniel the largest striker they had, a wooden mallet wrapped in leather, designed to ring a bell this size without damaging it. Strike it at the thickest point, just above the rim. One firm blow, let the bell speak for itself. Daniel positioned himself, raised the mallet, and struck. The sound that emerged was unlike anything he had heard before. Deep, resonant, powerful enough to shake dust from the rafters and make the 6 smaller bells vibrate in sympathetic response. 512 hertz exactly. The final note, the completion of the octave. But more than that, when struck, the 7 bells began to ring together, their individual frequencies combining and interfacing, creating harmonics that filled the foundry with something that sounded like a choir, like voices. like the proof that William Whitmore had been right about everything that mattered. The bells sang, not separately, together, 7 notes becoming one sound, one voice, one legacy that would outlast everyone in the room and everyone who came after them. Thomas wept. Robert put a hand on his shoulder. Father Michael closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. Catherine recorded everything, tears running down her face as she documented the moment when impossible became real. And Daniel stood with his hand on Ranger's head, listening to the bells sing, thinking about his son and his father and William Whitmore and all the men who had built things that mattered and died before they could see them completed. Thinking about how legacy was not about being remembered. It was about building something good enough and true enough and necessary enough that it survived whether anyone remembered your name or not. The bells rang for 2 full minutes before fading into silence. And in that silence, Daniel heard his answer. This was why he had stayed. This was what Ryan would have wanted. This was how you turned grief into something that helped instead of hurt. You built bells that remembered, that witnessed, that called people home when they had forgotten the way. Thomas spoke, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. The foundry is yours, Daniel. You have earned it. You and Marcus and Tommy and everyone who helped. This place belongs to you now. Daniel looked at the 7 bells, at the men who had become brothers, at the young who had learned to trust again. We will keep it, he said, but not as a museum, as a working foundry. We will teach others, make more bells, bells for churches, for memorials, for anyone who needs to remember something they are afraid of forgetting. Robert spoke up. I can help with that. Funding, lawyers, whatever you need to make this sustainable. He looked at Thomas. I cannot undo what I did to your brother, but I can help protect what he built, if you will let me. Thomas held out a shaking hand. Robert took it. And outside, beyond the foundry walls, Northwind Lake reflected the Christmas morning sun, its frozen surface hiding the workshop that would stay hidden, the knowledge that would wait until the world was ready, the choices that had been made in the name of wisdom rather than pride. The bells hung silent now, waiting for the next time they would be called to sing. But they would sing again. That was the promise Daniel made, standing in the foundry his son's grandfather had known, holding a legacy that stretched backward and forward through time. They would sing, and in their singing, the dead would have voice again. Not as ghosts, but as memory made permanent, as love that refused to end, as proof that what we build matters more than what we lose. If only we have the courage to keep building. Thomas Whitmore died 3 days after Christmas, in his chair by the forge, wrapped in the same blankets he had worn for weeks, his hands finally still after a lifetime of trembling. He went quietly, the way old men sometimes do when they have finished what they came to do, slipping from sleep into whatever comes after with so little fanfare that it took Daniel several minutes to realize the old man's breathing had stopped and would not resume. It was early morning, that blue hour before dawn, when the world holds its breath between darkness and light. Daniel had been stoking the forge, preparing for another day of work, when he noticed the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of a deeper quiet, the kind that settles over a space when something essential has departed. He set down the poker and walked to Thomas's chair. The old man looked smaller in death, as if whatever had animated him, whatever stubborn force had kept him upright and functioning, despite a body that wanted to quit, had been substantial enough to take physical mass with it when it left. His face was peaceful, the lines of pain and worry smoothed into an expression that suggested he had seen something at the end that pleased him. His right hand rested on the arm of the chair, palm up, fingers slightly curled as if reaching for something just beyond grasp. Daniel knelt beside the chair and placed his own hand over Thomas's. The skin was cool, but not yet cold, still holding the last traces of warmth that proved a life had been there moments before. He stayed like that for several minutes, saying nothing, thinking nothing, just being present for a man who had given him purpose when he had been running out of reasons to have any. Ranger patted over, sniffed Thomas's hand, then sat beside Daniel and leaned against his leg. The dog understood death, had seen enough of it to know what it looked like, what it meant. He gave a soft whine, not quite grief, but acknowledgement, the sound animals make when they witness the passing of pack members. Father Michael arrived an hour later, summoned by a phone call Daniel made with hands that shook more than he expected. The priest stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene, then crossed himself and moved to kneel on Thomas's other side. He spoke in Latin first, words Daniel did not understand but recognized as the language the church used when speaking to God about the dead. Then he switched to English. He waited for this, waited to see the bells complete, waited to know his brother's work would continue, and then he let go. That is grace, Daniel, to hold on exactly long enough and not a moment longer. They sat with the body until the county coroner arrived, a woman in her 40s who had handled enough small-town deaths to approach them with both efficiency and gentleness. She examined Thomas briefly, noted the time, asked the necessary questions. Natural causes, no signs of distress, an old man whose heart had simply decided it had beaten enough times and could rest now. After she left with the body, Daniel stood in the empty foundry and felt the weight of what came next. Thomas was gone. The challenge was complete. The foundry was his, and he had absolutely no idea what he was supposed to do with a 140-year-old building full of bells and ghosts and expectations. Marcus arrived mid-morning, took one look at Daniel's face, and knew. When? This morning. Before dawn. He was here 1 minute and gone the next. Marcus nodded, pulled out his phone, made calls. Within an hour, Tommy Chen was there. Then Catherine Reeves. Then Father Michael returned with coffee and sandwiches no one felt like eating, but everyone consumed anyway because bodies need fuel even when hearts are broken. Robert Brennan came last, driving up in a truck instead of his sedan, wearing work clothes instead of a suit. He stood in the doorway the way he had during his first visit, but everything about his posture had changed. Then he had looked like a man surveying property he intended to acquire. Now he looked like someone asking permission to enter a space that did not belong to him. "I heard," Robert said. "I am sorry." He meant it. The words were simple but carried weight because they came from someone who understood that sorry was insufficient but necessary anyway. "He got what he wanted," Daniel replied. "Saw the bells finished, passed the foundry to someone who would protect it. That is more than most people get." They held the funeral 3 days later at the church where Father Michael had served for 40 years before retiring. The building was small, white clapboard with a steeple that needed paint, but it was full. Townspeople who remembered Thomas, veterans who had heard about the foundry and what it was becoming, the sheriff, the coroner, Catherine with her camera, documenting everything because that was how she honored things that mattered. Marcus gave the eulogy because Daniel could not, his voice catching every time he tried to put into words what Thomas had meant. Marcus spoke instead about legacy, about how some men leave behind children, and some leave behind buildings, and some leave behind ideas that change how other people see the world. Thomas left behind all three, he said. The foundry is his child. The bells are his buildings. And the idea that memory can be made permanent, that what we lose does not have to be forgotten. That is what he taught everyone who knew him. They buried Thomas next to his brother William in the cemetery at the edge of town, 2 headstones side by side under an oak tree that had probably witnessed both their births. The graves were simple, just names and dates and the words Thomas had requested. Here lie 2 brothers who believed in making things that last. The bells will tell you if they succeeded. Robert stood at the graveside after everyone else had left, staring at William's headstone, his face unreadable. Daniel waited nearby, giving him space but ready to intervene if the old man's grief turned destructive. But Robert just stood there, silent, and eventually he spoke without turning around. "I told him his death would be meaningless, that no one would remember what he stood for. I was wrong about that too." He looked at Daniel. "You are going to make sure people remember, aren't you?" "That is the plan." "Then let me help. Not with money, with work. I can teach people how to pour bronze, how to read metal, how to know when something is ready and when it needs more time. I learned all of that before the war turned me into something else. Maybe I can remember how to be that person again." Daniel considered this. Considered whether redemption was something you earned or something you were given. Decided it was probably both. "We start next week. Be here at 6 a.m., dress for heat and hard work." Robert nodded, turned to leave, then stopped. "Thank you for not giving up on me. I know I did not deserve that." "None of us deserve the chances we get," Daniel replied. "We just try to be worth them afterward." The first month was chaos. Organizing the foundry, filing paperwork with the state to establish it as a nonprofit, applying for grants and historic preservation funds. Catherine handled most of the bureaucracy, navigating systems she had dealt with for years through the Historical Society. Daniel focused on the physical work, training Marcus and Tommy and Robert in the precise craft of bell making, turning amateurs into apprentices who might someday become masters. They cast their first commissioned bell in February, a small one for a church in Iowa that had lost its original in a fire. The pastor sent specific requirements: a tone that would carry half a mile, a sound that felt like hope without being saccharine. Daniel spent a week testing alloys and temperatures before settling on a bronze ratio slightly higher in tin than traditional, creating a brighter, more piercing note that cut through wind and distance. When the bell was finished and shipped and installed, the pastor called to say that the first time it rang, 3 people in town who had been planning to leave decided to stay. "I do not know if that is the bell's doing or coincidence," the pastor said, "but I choose to believe it matters." "So do I," Daniel replied. Word spread, not through advertising, but through the old networks of church and community and people who still believe that some things should be made by hand instead of stamped out in factories. Orders came in slowly at first, then faster. A bell for a memorial in Montana, a set of 3 for a school in Wisconsin that wanted to honor teachers who had died, a single large bell for a veterans cemetery in Virginia, meant to ring on Memorial Day and Veterans Day, and any other time someone needed to remember that sacrifice was not abstract, but specific and named. By spring, they had a waiting list. By summer, they were hiring. The first apprentice was a woman named Sarah Chen, Tommy's daughter, who had grown up watching her father build furniture with one hand and wanted to learn a craft that demanded precision under pressure. The second was a veteran named James Rodriguez, Marine Corps, Iraq, who arrived with PTSD so severe he could not sleep more than 2 hours without nightmares. Working the forge, he said, gave him something to focus on that was not the past. The heat and the metal and the absolute requirement to pay attention or fail, it created a kind of peace he had not found anywhere else. Daniel understood that, had found the same thing himself. The foundry did not erase the grief or the guilt or the memories, but it gave them weight and shape and purpose. It turned them into something that could be carried instead of something that crushed you. Ranger became the foundry's unofficial mascot, greeting visitors, sleeping near the forge, offering the silent support of presence in the way dogs do when they finally feel safe enough to relax. The veterans who came to learn, to visit, to stand near the bells and feel whatever it was that bells made people feel, they gravitated toward the dog, sat with him, told him things they could not tell people, and Ranger listened with the patience of a creature who had heard it all before and knew that sometimes listening was the only help that mattered. By autumn, the foundry had cast 43 bells, small ones, large ones, each unique, each carrying the fingerprints and breath and intention of the people who made it. They began a tradition. Every bell, before it left the foundry, was struck once in the presence of everyone who had worked on it, and each person spoke a name, someone they needed to remember, someone who deserved to be witnessed. The bell of memory had taught them that remembering was not passive, it was active, it was work. And if you were going to do it, you might as well do it in a way that gave the memory a voice. Father Michael started bringing veterans to the foundry, men and women from conflicts stretching back to Vietnam, people who carried wounds that never showed up on x-rays or medical charts. He did not call it therapy, he called it visiting. But Daniel saw what happened, saw the way their shoulders loosened when the bells rang, saw the way they breathed deeper when they were allowed to speak names into bronze that would hold them when flesh and memory failed, saw the transformation that came from making something permanent in a world that felt increasingly temporary. One veteran, a woman named Patricia who had served in Afghanistan as a medic, told Daniel that the first time she heard the bells ring together, all 7 in harmony, she cried for the first time since coming home. "I thought I was broken," she said, that something essential had been damaged and could not be fixed. But hearing those bells, I realized I was not broken. I was just carrying weight I did not know how to set down. This place teaches you how to set it down, not by forgetting, by transforming it into something that helps instead of hurts. That became their unofficial mission statement. We do not help you forget, we help you transform. By winter, a year after Thomas died, the foundry had become something no one had quite planned, but everyone recognized as necessary. Part workshop, part memorial, part healing center. They had cast 97 bells, trained 15 apprentices, hosted 342 veterans who came to visit, to learn, to find whatever it was they were looking for in the sound of bronze singing. Daniel stood in the foundry on Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after the master bell had been cast, and looked at what they had built. Marcus was working the forge, teaching Sarah Chen how to read temperature by color instead of thermometer. Tommy was in the workshop building molds for a set of bells commissioned by a cemetery in Texas. Robert was at the polishing station working on a bell meant for a church in his hometown, his hands steady now, the tremor of guilt and age and regret smoothed out by repetition and purpose. Father Michael sat in Thomas's old chair, which they had kept by the forge as both memorial and reminder. He was reading from a book of poetry, something about how light changes everything it touches, how memory is just light that refuses to fade. Ranger slept at his feet, gray around the muzzle now, slower but content, a dog who had found his pack and decided that was enough. Catherine appeared at Daniel's elbow, camera in hand as always. Quite a year. Quite a year, Daniel agreed. Thomas would be proud. I hope so. She showed him her camera screen, a photograph she had taken that morning. Daniel standing at the workbench, hands black with soot, surrounded by bells in various stages of completion, his face caught in profile as he examined the curve of a mold. He looked older than he remembered being, more weathered, but also more solid somehow. Less like a man running and more like a man who had arrived. You should see this, Catherine said. See what you have become. What have I become? Someone who builds instead of runs. Someone who transforms grief into grace. She lowered the camera. Someone your son would recognize. The words hit harder than Daniel expected. He had to turn away, blinking against the sudden pressure behind his eyes. A year of work and purpose, and slowly learning to breathe again. And still the mention of Ryan could reduce him to fighting tears. Sorry, Catherine said softly. I did not mean to. No, Daniel managed. It is okay. It is good. I need to remember that he is why I am here. Why any of this matters. That night, after everyone had left, Daniel sat alone in the foundry with just Ranger for company. He pulled out his phone and opened the folder of photographs he had not looked at in months. Ryan in uniform. Ryan as a child. Ryan at his high school graduation, grinning at the camera with the kind of confidence that came from not yet knowing how fragile life was. Daniel scrolled through them slowly, letting himself feel the loss without trying to run from it or fix it or turn it into something it was not. Just grief. Simple. Pure. The price you paid for loving someone who did not get to stay. His phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something made him open it. The message read, Mr. Cross, my name is David Martinez. I am a sergeant in the Army. I served with your son in Afghanistan. I have been trying to find you for 2 years. I have something that belongs to him. Something I think you should have. Can we meet? Daniel stared at the message for a long time. Then he typed back, yes. Tell me when and where. They met a week later at a diner halfway between Northwind and the military base where David was stationed. The sergeant was young, maybe 26, with the kind of face that looked like it had seen too much too soon. He carried a backpack, worn and faded, and when he sat down across from Daniel, he did not waste time with pleasantries. Your son saved my life, David said. We were on patrol, EOD mission. Ryan was lead tech. There was an IED, bigger than we expected, and the trigger mechanism was rigged to blow if we approached from any direction except one. Ryan figured it out. Spent 3 hours in 110-degree heat dismantling it piece by piece while I provided cover. When it was done, he looked at me and said, that is how my dad taught me. Slow and steady, no shortcuts. He pulled a notebook from his backpack. He kept a journal, wrote in it every night. He told me if anything happened to him, I should make sure you got this. But when he died, I was medevaced out for injuries. By the time I got back, his effects had already been shipped home. I thought his journal went with them. But I found it last month, mixed in with my gear. He must have given it to me to hold before that last mission. I did not realize until I was going through old stuff. He slid the notebook across the table. It was small, military issue, the kind designed to fit in a cargo pocket. The cover was stained and bent, the pages inside filled with Ryan's handwriting, small and precise, the letters marching across lines with the discipline of a man trained to document everything. Daniel opened it. The entries were dated, brief, factual accounts of missions and weather, and the small details that made up life in a war zone. But scattered throughout were other things, observations, thoughts, and every few pages a direct address. Dad, if you are reading this. His hands shook as he read. Dad, if you are reading this, it means I did not make it home. I am sorry for that. Not because I regret the choice to serve, but because I know how hard it will be for you. You taught me that some things are worth the risk, worth more than safety or comfort or even life. You taught me that by example, by every bomb you diffused, every life you saved. I know you retired early because you were tired, because you had done enough. But I want you to know that I never blamed you for not being here. You gave me something better than your presence. You gave me your example. You showed me what it looks like to face fear with steady hands and a clear mind, to do the hard thing because it is the right thing. That is why I am here. Not because you were not, because you were and you taught me what mattered. If I die doing this work, know that I died at doing something I believed in, something I learned to believe in from you. Do not carry me as guilt. Carry me as proof that what you taught mattered, that it still matters, that it will always matter. I love you, Dad. I am proud to be your son. And wherever you are when you read this, I need you to know that you did not fail me. You gave me everything I needed. The rest was my choice. Honor that choice by living, by building, by showing other people that even after loss, there is work worth doing. Be the man you taught me to be. That is how you honor me, not by grieving forever, by living well. Daniel read the entry 3 times, then closed the notebook and sat with his hands flat on its cover, feeling the weight of words his son had written, knowing they might be the last thing his father ever heard from him. David watched him silently, gave him space. Finally, Daniel looked up. Thank you for bringing this. He would have wanted you to have it. David paused. There is one more thing. Ryan talked about you constantly, told everyone about the EOD tech who taught him everything. I did not understand what he meant until I Googled your name last week and found articles about the foundry, about what you are building. He smiled slightly. I think he would be proud. I think he would say, you finally figured out what he was trying to tell you. What was he trying to tell me? That legacy is not about what you leave behind when you die. It is about what you build while you are alive. You are building something that will outlast all of us. That is the best kind of memorial. They talked for another hour. David told stories about Ryan, missions, jokes, the time Ryan defused a bomb while singing Johnny Cash because it helped him think. The time he traded his dessert rations to local kids in exchange for information about IED locations. The small kindnesses and competencies that added up to a life well lived, even if it was lived briefly. When they parted, David shook Daniel's hand and said, if you ever need anything, if the foundry needs anything, you have a whole community of veterans who would be honored to help. Ryan was one of ours. That makes you one of ours too. Daniel drove back to Northwind with the notebook on the passenger seat where Ranger usually rode. The dog was at the foundry, probably sleeping by the forge, content to wait for Daniel to return. But having the notebook there felt right, like Ryan was riding beside him one more time. That night, Daniel did something he had been planning for months, but had not found the courage to execute. He cast a miniature version of the master bell, 6 inches tall, perfect in every detail. And when it cooled, he did not strike it in the foundry. Instead, he loaded it carefully into a padded box, along with 96 others he and the apprentices had cast over the past year. 97 miniature bells, each one inscribed with a name, each one meant for a specific grave. He drove to Arlington National Cemetery, the journey taking 2 days, and when he arrived, he requested a meeting with the superintendent, explained what he wanted to do. The superintendent listened, made some calls, and gave permission. Daniel spent the next week visiting graves. Each bell was placed at the headstone of a veteran whose family had requested it. Small bronze bells, each one tuned to a specific frequency, each one able to ring when the wind caught it just right. He placed them carefully, securing them with stakes designed to hold without damaging the hallowed ground. Ryan's grave was last. Daniel knelt in the grass, feeling the cold January earth through his jeans, and placed the miniature master bell at the base of his son's headstone. Corporal Ryan Cross, beloved son, faithful servant, skilled technician, gone but never forgotten. The wind picked up, moving across the cemetery, and the bell rang. Just once, soft and clear. The same note the master bell sang, just quieter, more intimate. The sound a bell makes when it is speaking to one person instead of calling to many. Ranger, who had made the trip and waited patiently through every grave visit, padded forward and lay down beside the headstone, his head resting on his paws, eyes fixed on Daniel with an expression that was somehow both sad and content. Daniel pulled out the notebook. Read the entry one more time. Then he spoke aloud, his voice rough but steady. You were right, Ryan, about all of it. Legacy is not what you leave behind. It is what you build, and I am building. Every day. Bells that remember, bells that witness, bells that call people together when everything else drives them apart. I am teaching others to do the same. Marcus, Tommy, Robert, Sarah, James, all the others who come because they need purpose and find it in fire and bronze, in the work of making things that last. He paused, gathering himself. I miss you. Every day, every hour. But the missing does not break me anymore. It shapes me. Like heat shapes metal. Like pressure turns coal into diamonds. You made me better by being my son. And I am trying to honor that by being better than I was. By being the man you thought I was, even when I knew I was not. The wind shifted. The bell rang again. This time it was joined by another bell 20 yards away. Then another. Then another. 97 miniature bells across Arlington, all ringing in response to the same gust of wind, creating a symphony of memory and witness and love that refused to be silenced by death. Daniel stood, placed his hand on the headstone, felt the cold granite under his palm and the warm sun on his back and the impossible coexistence of loss and hope that defined what it meant to survive the unsurvivable. Come on, Ranger, he said quietly. We have work to do. The dog rose, stretched, and followed Daniel back to the truck. They drove north toward Northwind, toward the foundry, toward the life Daniel had built from the broken pieces of the life he had lost. The bells in Arlington kept ringing behind them, fading as distance grew but never quite disappearing, the sound carrying on wind that knew no borders, no limits, no ending. Back at the foundry, the others were waiting. Marcus had a new commission, a set of 7 bells for a veterans memorial in Montana. Tommy had completed the molds. Robert had prepared the forge. Sarah and James and the other apprentices stood ready to begin. Daniel walked in, Ranger at his heels, and looked at the work waiting to be done. Looked at the people who had become family. Looked at the 7 bells that started it all, hanging in their place of honor, ready to sing whenever someone needed to hear that memory could be made permanent and loss could be transformed into legacy. He pulled on his work gloves, approached the forge, and began. Because that was what you did when you stopped running and started building. You showed up. You did the work. You made things that would outlast you. You taught others to do the same. And you trusted that somewhere, somehow, the people you had lost were watching and approving and telling you to keep going because the work was not done and might never be done. But that was okay because the work itself was the point, not the completion, the work, not the arrival, the journey, not the forgetting, the remembering. Daniel poured bronze into the waiting mold, watching liquid fire become solid truth, and thought about his son and his father and William Whitmore and Thomas and all the men who had taught him that some things were worth more than safety, worth more than comfort, worth more than life itself. Things like integrity, like purpose, like the stubborn insistence that what we build matters and who we build it for matters and how we build it matters, because we are not just making objects. We are making memory. We are making meaning. We are making proof that we were here and it meant something. The bronze settled, the mold cooled, and somewhere in the silence between heartbeats, Daniel heard it, not with his ears, with something deeper, the sound of his son's voice, clear and certain and proud. Well done, Dad. Keep going. I will be listening. The forge glowed. The bells waited. And Daniel Cross, bellmaker, veteran, father, survivor, stood in the heat and the light in the sacred space of making things that last. And he smiled. Because he had finally learned what Thomas tried to teach him from the beginning. A bell does not end a life. It echoes it. Forever. The end.